Wounds in the Rain War Stories by Stephen Crane. Story 1. The Price of the Harness. Parts 1, 2, and 3. 1. 25 men were making a road out of a path up the hillside. The light batteries in the rear were impatient to advance, but first must be done all that digging and smoothing which gains no encrusted medals from war. The men worked like gardeners, and a road was growing from the old pack animal trail. Trees arched from a field of guinea grass which resembled young wild corn. The day was still and dry. The men working were dressed in the consistent blue of United States regulars. They looked indifferent, almost stolid, despite the heat and the labor. There was little talking. From time to time a government pack train, led by a sleek-sided, tender bell mare, came from one way or the other way, and the men stood aside as the strong, hard, black and tan animals crowded eagerly after their curious little feminine leader. A volunteer staff officer appeared, and, sitting on his horse in the middle of the work, asked the sergeant in command some questions which were apparently not relevant to any military business. Men straggling along on various duties almost invariably spun some kind of a joke as they passed. A corporal and 4 men were guarding boxes of spare ammunition at the top of the hill, and one of the number often went to the foot of the hill swinging canteens. The day wore down to the Cuban dusk, in which the shadows are all grim and of ghostly shape. The men began to lift their eyes from the shovels and picks, and glance in the direction of their camp. The sun threw his last glance through the foliage. The steep mountain range on the right turned blue and as without detail as a curtain. The tiny ruby of light ahead meant that the ammunition guard were cooking their supper. From somewhere in the world came a single rifle shot. Figures appeared, dim in the shadow of the trees. A murmur, a sigh of quiet relief, arose from the working party. Later they swung up the hill in an unformed formation, being always like soldiers and unable even to carry a spade save like United States regular soldiers. As they passed through some fields, the bland white light of the end of the day feebly touched each hard bronze profile. "Wonder if we'll get anything to eat," said Watkins in a low voice. "Should think so," said Nolan in the same tone. They betrayed no impatience. They seemed to feel a kind of awe of the situation. The sergeant turned. One could see the cool grey eye flashing under the brim of the campaign hat. "What in hell you fellers kicking about?" he asked. They made no reply, understanding that they were being suppressed. As they moved on, a murmur arose from the tall grass on either side. It was the noise from the bivouac of 10,000 men, although one saw practically nothing from the low cart roadway. The sergeant led his party up a wet clay bank and into a trampled field. Here were scattered tiny white shelter tents, and in the darkness they were luminous, like the rearing stones in a graveyard. A few fires burned blood red, and the shadowy figures of men moved with no more expression of detail than there is in the swaying of foliage on a windy night. The working party felt their way to where their tents were pitched. A man suddenly cursed. He had mislaid something, and he knew he was not going to find it that night. Watkins spoke again with the monotony of a clock. "Wonder if we'll get anything to eat." Martin, with eyes turned pensively to the stars, began a treatise. "Them Spaniards—" "Oh, quit it!" cried Nolan. "What the piper do you know about the Spaniards, you fat-headed Dutchman? Better think of your belly, you blunderin' swine, and what you're going to put in it, grass or dirt." A laugh, a sort of a deep growl, arose from the prostrate men. In the meantime the sergeant had reappeared and was standing over them. "No rations to night," he said gruffly, and turning on his heel walked away. This announcement was received in silence, but Watkins had flung himself face downward, and putting his lips close to a tuft of grass, he formulated oaths. Martin arose and, going to his shelter, crawled in sulkily. After a long interval, Nolan said aloud, "Hell!" Grierson, enlisted for the war, raised a querulous voice, "Well, I wonder when we will get fed." From the ground about him came a low chuckle, full of ironical comment about Grierson's lack of certain qualities which the other men felt themselves to possess. II. In the cold light of dawn the men were on their knees, packing, strapping, and buckling. The comic toy hamlet of shelter tents had been wiped out as if by a cyclone. Through the trees could be seen the crimson of a light battery's blankets, and the wheels creaked like the sound of a musketry fight. Nolan, well gripped by his shelter tent, his blanket, and his cartridge belt, and bearing his rifle, advanced upon a small group of men who were hastily finishing a can of coffee. "Say, give us a drink, will you?" he asked wistfully. He was as sad-eyed as an orphan beggar. Every man in the group turned to look him straight in the face. He had asked for the principal ruby out of each one's crown. There was a grim silence. Then one said, "What fer?" Nolan cast his glance to the ground and went away abashed. But he espied Watkins and Martin surrounding Grierson, who had gained 3 pieces of hardtack by mere force of his audacious inexperience. Grierson was fending his comrades off tearfully. "Now don't be damned pigs!" he cried. "Hold on a minute." Here Nolan asserted a claim. Grierson groaned. Kneeling piously, he divided the hardtack with minute care into 4 portions. The men, who had had their heads together like players watching a wheel of fortune, arose suddenly, each chewing. Nolan interpolated a drink of water and sighed contentedly. The whole forest seemed to be moving. From the field on the other side of the road a column of men in blue was slowly pouring. The battery had creaked on ahead. From the rear came a hum of advancing regiments. Then from a mile away rang the noise of a shot. Then another shot. In a moment the rifles there were drumming, drumming, drumming. The artillery boomed out suddenly. A day of battle was begun. The men made no exclamations. They rolled their eyes in the direction of the sound, and then swept with a calm glance the forests and the hills which surrounded them, implacably mysterious forests and hills, which lent to every rifle shot the ominous quality which belongs to secret assassination. The whole scene would have spoken to the private soldiers of ambushes, sudden flank attacks, terrible disasters, if it were not for those cool gentlemen with shoulder straps and swords, who, the private soldiers knew, were of another world and omnipotent for the business. The battalions moved out into the mud and began a leisurely march in the damp shade of the trees. The advance of 2 batteries had churned the black soil into a formidable paste. The brown leggings of the men, stained with the mud of other days, took on a deeper colour. Perspiration broke gently out on the reddish faces. With his heavy roll of blanket and the half of a shelter tent crossing his right shoulder and under his left arm, each man presented the appearance of being clasped from behind, wrestler fashion, by a pair of thick white arms. There was something distinctive in the way they carried their rifles. There was the grace of an old hunter somewhere in it, the grace of a man whose rifle has become absolutely a part of himself. Furthermore, almost every blue shirt sleeve was rolled to the elbow, disclosing forearms of almost incredible brawn. The rifles seemed light, almost fragile, in the hands that were at the end of these arms, never fat, but always with rolling muscles and veins that seemed on the point of bursting. And another thing was the silence and the marvellous impassivity of the faces as the column made its slow way toward where the whole forest spluttered and fluttered with battle. Opportunely the battalion was halted astraddle of a stream, and before it again moved most of the men had filled their canteens. The firing increased. Ahead and to the left a battery was booming at methodical intervals, while the infantry racket was that continual drumming which after all often sounds like rain on a roof. Directly ahead one could hear the deep voices of field pieces. Some wounded Cubans were carried by in litters improvised from hammocks swung on poles. One had a ghastly cut in the throat, probably from a fragment of shell, and his head was turned, as if Providence particularly wished to display this wide and lapping gash to the long column that was winding toward the front. And another Cuban, shot through the groin, kept up a continual wail as he swung from the tread of his bearers. "Ay, ay, madre mia, madre mia!" He sang this bitter ballad into the ears of at least 3,000 men as they slowly made way for his bearers on the narrow wood path. These wounded insurgents were, then, to a large part of the advancing army, the visible messengers of bloodshed and death, and the men regarded them with thoughtful awe. This doleful, sobbing cry, "Madre mia," was a tangible, consequent misery of all that firing on in front, into which the men knew they were soon to be plunged. Some of them wished to inquire of the bearers the details of what had happened, but they could not speak Spanish, and so it was as if fate had intentionally sealed the lips of all in order that even meagre information might not leak out concerning this mystery, battle. On the other hand, many unversed private soldiers looked upon the unfortunate as men who had seen thousands maimed and bleeding, and absolutely could not conjure any further interest in such scenes. A young staff officer passed on horseback. The vocal Cuban was always wailing, but the officer wheeled past the bearers without heeding anything. And yet he never before had seen such a sight. His case was different from that of the private soldiers. He heeded nothing because he was busy, immensely busy and hurried with a multitude of reasons and desires for doing his duty perfectly. His whole life had been a mere period of preliminary reflection for this situation, and he had no clear idea of anything save his obligation as an officer. A man of this kind might be stupid. It is conceivable that in remote cases certain bumps on his head might be composed entirely of wood, but these traditions of fidelity and courage, which have been handed to him from generation to generation, and which he has tenaciously preserved, despite the persecution of legislators and the indifference of his country, make it incredible that in battle he should ever fail to give his best blood and his best thought for his general, for his men, and for himself. And so this young officer in the shapeless hat and the torn and dirty shirt failed to heed the wails of the wounded man, even as the pilgrim fails to heed the world as he raises his illumined face toward his purpose, rightly or wrongly his purpose, his sky of the ideal of duty. And the wonderful part of it is that he is guided by an ideal which he has himself created and has alone protected from attack. The young man was merely an officer in the United States regular army. The column swung across a shallow ford and took a road which passed the right flank of one of the American batteries. On a hill it was booming and belching great clouds of white smoke. The infantry looked up with interest. Arrayed below the hill and behind the battery were the horses and limbers, the riders checking their pawing mounts, and behind each rider a red blanket flamed against the fervent green of the bushes. As the infantry moved along the road, some of the battery horses turned at the noise of the trampling feet and surveyed the men with eyes as deep as wells, serene, mournful, generous eyes, lit heart-breakingly with something that was akin to a philosophy, a religion of self-sacrifice. Oh, gallant, gallant horses! "I know a feller in that battery," said Nolan, musingly. "A driver." "Damn sight rather be a gunner," said Martin. "Why would ye?" said Nolan, opposingly. "Well, I'd take my chances as a gunner before I'd sit way up in the air on a raw boned plug and git shot at." "Aw " began Nolan. "They've had some losses to day, all right," interrupted Grierson. "Horses?" asked Watkins. "Horses and men, too," said Grierson. "How'd you know?" "A feller told me there by the ford." They kept only a part of their minds bearing on this discussion, because they could already hear high in the air the wire string note of the enemy's bullets. III. The road taken by this battalion as it followed other battalions is something less than a mile long in its journey across a heavily wooded plain. It is greatly changed now. In fact, it was metamorphosed in 2 days. But at that time it was a mere track through dense shrubbery, from which rose great dignified arching trees. It was, in fact, a path through a jungle. The battalion had no sooner left the battery in rear when bullets began to drive overhead. They made several different sounds, but as these were mainly high shots, it was usual for them to make the faint note of a vibrant string, touched elusively, half dreamily. The military balloon, a fat, wavering yellow thing, was leading the advance like some new conception of war god. Its bloated mass shone above the trees, and served incidentally to indicate to the men at the rear that comrades were in advance. The track itself exhibited for all its visible length a closely knit procession of soldiers in blue with breasts crossed with white shelter tents. The first ominous order of battle came down the line. "Use the cut off. Don't use the magazine till you're ordered." Non-commissioned officers repeated the command gruffly. A sound of clicking locks rattled along the columns. All men knew that the time had come. The front had burst out with a roar like a brush fire. The balloon was dying, dying, a gigantic and public death before the eyes of 2 armies. It quivered, sank, faded into the trees amid the flurry of a battle that was suddenly and tremendously like a storm. The American battery thundered behind the men with a shock that seemed likely to tear the backs of their heads off. The Spanish shrapnel fled on a line to their left, swirling and swishing in supernatural velocity. The noise of the rifle bullets broke in their faces like the noise of so many lamp chimneys, or sped overhead in swift, cruel spitting. And in the front the battle sound, as if it were simply music, was beginning to swell and swell until the volleys rolled like a surf. The officers shouted hoarsely, "Come on, men! Hurry up, boys! Come on now, hurry up!" The soldiers, running heavily in their accoutrements, dashed forward. A baggage guard was swiftly detailed. The men tore their rolls from their shoulders as if the things were afire. The battalion, stripped for action, again dashed forward. "Come on, men! Come on!" To them the battle was as yet merely a road through the woods, crowded with troops who lowered their heads anxiously as the bullets fled high. But a moment later the column wheeled abruptly to the left and entered a field of tall green grass. The line scattered to a skirmish formation. In front was a series of knolls treed sparsely like orchards. And although no enemy was visible, these knolls were all popping and spitting with rifle fire. In some places there were to be seen long grey lines of dirt. Entrenchments. The American shells were kicking up reddish clouds of dust from the brow of one of the knolls, where stood a pagoda-like house. It was not much like a battle with men. It was a battle with a bit of charming scenery, enigmatically potent for death. Nolan knew that Martin had suddenly fallen. "What " he began. "They've hit me," said Martin. "Jesus!" said Nolan. Martin lay on the ground, clutching his left forearm just below the elbow with all the strength of his right hand. His lips were pursed ruefully. He did not seem to know what to do. He continued to stare at his arm. Then suddenly the bullets drove at them, low and hard. The men flung themselves face downward in the grass. Nolan lost all thought of his friend. Oddly enough, he felt somewhat like a man hiding under a bed, and he was just as sure that he could not raise his head high without being shot as a man hiding under a bed is sure that he cannot raise his head without bumping it. A lieutenant was seated in the grass just behind him. He was in the careless and yet rigid pose of a man balancing a loaded plate on his knee at a picnic. He was talking in soothing, paternal tones. "Now, don't get rattled. We're all right here. Just as safe as being in church. They're all going high. Don't mind them. Don't mind them. They're all going high. We've got them rattled and they can't shoot straight. Don't mind them." The sun burned down steadily from a pale blue sky upon the crackling woods and knolls and fields. From the roar of musketry it might have been that the celestial heat was frying this part of the world. Nolan snuggled close to the grass. He watched a grey line of entrenchments, above which floated the veriest gossamer of smoke. A flag lolled on a staff behind it. The men in the trench volleyed whenever an American shell exploded near them. It was some kind of infantile defiance. Frequently a bullet came from the woods directly behind Nolan and his comrades. They thought at the time that these bullets were from the rifle of some incompetent soldier of their own side. There was no cheering. The men would have looked about them, wondering where was the army, if it were not that the crash of the fighting for the distance of a mile denoted plainly enough where was the army. Officially, the battalion had not yet fired a shot. There had been merely some irresponsible popping by men on the extreme left flank, but it was known that the lieutenant colonel, who had been in command, was dead, shot through the heart, and that the captains were thinned down to 2. At the rear went on a long tragedy, in which men, bent and hasty, hurried to shelter with other men, helpless, dazed and bloody. Nolan knew of it all from the hoarse and affrighted voices which he heard as he lay flattened in the grass. There came to him a sense of exultation. Here then was one of those dread and lurid situations which in a nation's history stand out in crimson letters, becoming a tale of blood to stir generation after generation. And he was in it and unharmed. If he lived through the battle he would be a hero of the desperate fight at . And here he wondered for a second what fate would be pleased to bestow as a name for this battle. But it is quite sure that hardly another man in the battalion was engaged in any thoughts concerning the historic. On the contrary, they deemed it ill that they were being badly cut up on a most unimportant occasion. It would have benefited the conduct of whoever were weak if they had known that they were engaged in a battle that would be famous forever. Section 2. Story 1. The Price of the Harness, Parts 4, 5, and 6. 4. Martin had picked himself up from where the bullet had knocked him, and addressed the lieutenant. "I'm hit, sir," he said. The lieutenant was very busy. All right," he said, just heeding the man enough to learn where he was wounded. "Go over that way. You ought to see a dressing station under those trees." Martin found himself dizzy and sick. The sensation in his arm was distinctly galvanic. The feeling was so strange that he could wonder at times if a wound was really what ailed him. Once, in this dazed way, he examined his arm. He saw the hole. Yes, he was shot, that was it, and more than in any other way it affected him with a profound sadness. As directed by the lieutenant, he went to the clump of trees, but he found no dressing station there. He found only a dead soldier lying with his face buried in his arms and with his shoulders humped high as if he were convulsively sobbing. Martin decided to make his way to the road, deeming that he thus would better his chances of getting to a surgeon. But he suddenly found his way blocked by a fence of barbed wire. Such was his mental condition that he brought up at a rigid halt before this fence and stared stupidly at it. It did not seem to him possible that this obstacle could be defeated by any means. The fence was there, and it stopped his progress. He could not go in that direction. But as he turned he espied that procession of wounded men, strange pilgrims, that had already worn a path in the tall grass. They were passing through a gap in the fence. Martin joined them. The bullets were flying over them in sheets, but many of them bore themselves as men who had now exacted from fate a singular immunity. Generally there were no outcries, no kicking, no talk at all. They, too, like Martin, seemed buried in a vague but profound melancholy. But there was one who cried out loudly. A man, shot in the head, was being carried arduously by 4 comrades, and he continually yelled one word that was terrible in its primitive strength: "Bread! Bread! Bread!" Following him and his bearers were a limping crowd of men less cruelly wounded, who kept their eyes always fixed on him, as if they gained from his extreme agony some balm for their own sufferings. "Bread! Give me bread!" Martin plucked a man by the sleeve. The man had been shot in the foot, and was making his way with the help of a curved, incompetent stick. It is an axiom of war that wounded men can never find straight sticks. "What's the matter with that feller?" asked Martin. "Nutty," said the man. "Why is he?" "Shot in the head," answered the other impatiently. The wail of the sufferer arose in the field amidst the swift rasp of bullets and the boom and shatter of shrapnel. "Bread! Bread! Oh, God! Can't you give me bread? Bread!" The bearers of him were suffering exquisite agony, and often they exchanged glances which exhibited their despair of ever getting free of this tragedy. It seemed endless. "Bread! Bread! Bread!" But despite the fact that there was always in the way of this crowd a wistful melancholy, one must know that there were plenty of men who laughed at their wounds whimsically, quaintly inventing odd humours concerning bicycles and cabs, extracting from this shedding of their blood a wonderful amount of material for cheerful badinage, and with their faces twisted from pain as they stepped, they often joked like music-hall stars, and perhaps this was the most tearful part of all. They trudged along a road until they reached a ford. Here under the eave of the bank lay a dismal company. In the mud, and in the damp shade of some bushes, were 100 pale-faced men prostrate. 2 or 3 surgeons were working there. Also there was a chaplain, grim-mouthed, resolute, his surtout discarded. Overhead always was that incessant, maddening wail of bullets. Martin was standing gazing drowsily at the scene when a surgeon grabbed him. "Here, what's the matter with you?" Martin was daunted. He wondered what he had done that the surgeon should be so angry with him. "In the arm," he muttered, half shamefacedly. After the surgeon had hastily and irritably bandaged the injured member, he glared at Martin and said: "You can walk all right, can't you?" "Yes, sir," said Martin. "Well, now, you just make tracks down that road." "Yes, sir." Martin went meekly off. The doctor had seemed exasperated almost to the point of madness. The road was at this time swept with the fire of a body of Spanish sharpshooters who had come cunningly around the flanks of the American army, and were now hidden in the dense foliage that lined both sides of the road. They were shooting at everything. The road was as crowded as a street in a city, and at an absurdly short range they emptied their rifles at the passing people. They were aided always by the oversweep from the regular Spanish line of battle. Martin was sleepy from his wound. He saw tragedy follow tragedy, but they created in him no feeling of horror. A man with a red cross on his arm was leaning against a great tree. Suddenly he tumbled to the ground and writhed for a moment in the way of a child oppressed with colic. A comrade immediately began to bustle importantly. "Here," he called to Martin, "help me carry this man, will you?" Martin looked at him with dull scorn. "I'll be damned if I do," he said. "Can't carry myself, let alone somebody else." This answer, which rings now so inhuman, pitiless, did not affect the other man. "Well, all right," he said. "Here come some other fellers." The wounded man had now turned blue grey. His eyes were closed. His body shook in a gentle, persistent chill. Occasionally Martin came upon dead horses, their limbs sticking out and up like stakes. One beast, mortally shot, was besieged by 3 or 4 men who were trying to push it into the bushes where it could live its brief time of anguish without thrashing to death any of the wounded men in the gloomy procession. The mule train, with extra ammunition, charged toward the front, still led by the tinkling bell mare. An ambulance was stuck momentarily in the mud, and above the crack of battle one could hear the familiar objurgations of the driver as he whirled his lash. 2 privates were having a hard time with a wounded captain whom they were supporting to the rear. He was half cursing, half wailing out the information that he not only would not go another step toward the rear, but that he was certainly going to return at once to the front. They begged, pleaded at great length as they continually headed him off. They were not unlike 2 nurses with an exceptionally bad and headstrong little duke. The wounded soldiers paused to look impassively upon this struggle. They were always like men who could not be aroused by anything further. The visible hospital was mainly straggling thickets intersected with narrow paths, the ground being covered with men. Martin saw a busy person with a book and a pencil, but he did not approach him to become officially a member of the hospital. All he desired was rest and immunity from nagging. He took seat painfully under a bush and leaned his back upon the trunk. There he remained, thinking, his face wooden. 5. "My God," said Nolan, squirming on his belly in the grass, "I can't stand this much longer." Then suddenly every rifle in the firing line seemed to go off of its own accord. It was the result of an order, but few men heard the order. In the main they had fired because they heard others fire, and their sense was so quick that the volley did not sound too ragged. These marksmen had been lying for nearly an hour in stony silence, their sights adjusted, their fingers fondling their rifles, their eyes staring at the entrenchments of the enemy. The battalion had suffered heavy losses, and these losses had been hard to bear, for a soldier always reasons that men lost during a period of inaction are men badly lost. The line now sounded like a great machine set to running frantically in the open air, the bright sunshine of a green field. To the prut of the magazine rifles was added the under chorus of the clicking mechanism, steady and swift, as if the hand of one operator was controlling it all. It reminds one always of a loom, a great, grand, steel loom, clinking, clanking, plunking, plinking, to weave a woof of thin red threads, the cloth of death. By the men's shoulders under their eager hands dropped continually the yellow empty shells spinning into the crushed grass blades to remain there and mark for the belated eye the line of a battalion's fight. All impatience, all rebellious feeling had passed out of the men as soon as they had been allowed to use their weapons against the enemy. They now were absorbed in this business of hitting something, and all the long training at the rifle ranges, all the pride of the marksman which had been so long alive in them, made them forget for the time everything but shooting. They were as deliberate and exact as so many watchmakers. A new sense of safety was rightfully upon them. They knew that those mysterious men in the high, far trenches in front were having the bullets sping in their faces with relentless and remarkable precision. They knew, in fact, that they were now doing the thing which they had been trained endlessly to do, and they knew that they were doing it well. Nolan, for instance, was overjoyed. "Plug 'em," he said, "plug 'em." He laid his face to his rifle as if it were his mistress. He was aiming under the shadow of a certain portico of a fortified house. There he could faintly see a long black line which he knew to be a loophole cut for riflemen, and he knew that every shot of his was going there under the portico, mayhap through the loophole to the brain of another man like himself. He loaded the awkward magazine of his rifle again and again. He was so intent that he did not know of new orders until he saw the men about him scrambling to their feet and running forward, crouching low as they ran. "Come on, boys. We can't be last. We're going up. We're going up." He sprang to his feet and, stooping, ran with the others. Something fine, soft, gentle touched his heart as he ran. He had loved the regiment, the army, because the regiment, the army, was his life. He had no other outlook. And now these men, his comrades, were performing his dream scenes for him. They were doing as he had ordained in his visions. It is curious that in this charge he considered himself as rather unworthy. Although he himself was in the assault with the rest of them, it seemed to him that his comrades were dazzlingly courageous. His part, to his mind, was merely that of a man who was going along with the crowd. He saw Grierson biting madly with his pincers at a barbed wire fence. They were halfway up the beautiful sylvan slope. There was no enemy to be seen, and yet the landscape rained bullets. Somebody punched him violently in the stomach. He thought dully to lie down and rest, but instead he fell with a crash. The sparse line of men in blue shirts and dirty slouch hats swept on up the hill. He decided to shut his eyes for a moment, because he felt very dreamy and peaceful. It seemed only a minute before he heard a voice say, "There he is." Grierson and Watkins had come to look for him. He searched their faces at once and keenly, for he had a thought that the line might be driven down the hill and leave him in Spanish hands. But he saw that everything was secure, and he prepared no questions. "Nolan," said Grierson clumsily, "do you know me?" The man on the ground smiled softly. "Of course I know you, you chowder-faced monkey. Why wouldn't I know you?" Watkins knelt beside him. "Where did they plug you, old boy?" Nolan was somewhat dubious. "It ain't much, I don't think, but it's somewheres there." He laid a finger on the pit of his stomach. They lifted his shirt, and then privately they exchanged a glance of horror. "Does it hurt, Jimmy?" said Grierson hoarsely. "No," said Nolan, "it don't hurt any, but I feel sort of dead to the world and numb all over. I don't think it's very bad." "Oh, it's all right," said Watkins. "What I need is a drink," said Nolan, grinning at them. "I'm chilly, lying on this damp ground." "It ain't very damp, Jimmy," said Grierson. "Well, it is damp," said Nolan, with sudden irritability. "I can feel it. I'm wet, I tell you, wet through, just from lying here." They answered hastily, "Yes, that's so, Jimmy. It is damp. That's so." "Just put your hand under my back and see how wet the ground is," he said. "No," they answered. "That's all right, Jimmy. We know it's wet." "Well, put your hand under and see," he cried stubbornly. "Oh, never mind, Jimmy." "No," he said in a temper. "See for yourself." Grierson seemed to be afraid of Nolan's agitation, and so he slipped a hand under the prostrate man and presently withdrew it covered with blood. "Yes," he said, hiding his hand carefully from Nolan's eyes. "You were right, Jimmy." "Of course I was," said Nolan, contentedly closing his eyes. "This hillside holds water like a swamp." After a moment he said, "Guess I ought to know. I'm flat here on it, and you fellows are standing up." He did not know he was dying. He thought he was holding an argument on the condition of the turf. 6. "Cover his face," said Grierson, in a low and husky voice afterwards. "What'll I cover it with?" said Watkins. They looked at themselves. They stood in their shirts, trousers, leggings, shoes. They had nothing. "Oh," said Grierson, "here's his hat." He brought it and laid it on the face of the dead man. They stood for a time. It was apparent that they thought it essential and decent to say or do something. Finally Watkins said in a broken voice, "Aw, it's a damn shame." They moved slowly off toward the firing line. In the blue gloom of evening, in one of the fever tents, the two rows of still figures became hideous charnel. The languid movement of a hand was surrounded with spectral mystery, and the occasional painful twisting of a body under a blanket was terrifying, as if dead men were moving in their graves under the sod. A heavy odour of sickness and medicine hung in the air. "What regiment are you in?" said a feeble voice. "29th Infantry," answered another voice. "29th? Why, the man on the other side of me is in the 29th." "He is? Hey there, partner, are you in the 29th?" A third voice merely answered wearily, "Martin, of C Company." "What? Jack, is that you?" "It's part of me. Who are you?" "Grierson, you fathead. I thought you were wounded." There was the noise of a man gulping a great drink of water, and at its conclusion Martin said, "I am." "Well, what are you doing in the fever place, then?" Martin replied with drowsy impatience, "Got the fever, too." "Gee!" said Grierson. Thereafter there was silence in the fever tent, save for the noise made by a man over in a corner, a kind of man always found in an American crowd, a heroic, implacable comedian and patriot, of a humour that has bitterness and ferocity and love in it, and he was wringing from the situation a grim meaning by singing the Star-Spangled Banner with all the ardour which could be procured from his fever-stricken body. "Billy," cried Martin in a low voice, "where's Jimmy Nolan?" "He's dead," said Grierson. A triangle of raw gold light shone on a side of the tent. Somewhere in the valley an engine's bell was ringing, and it sounded of peace and home as if it hung on a cow's neck. "And where's Ike Watkins?" "Well, he ain't dead, but he got shot through the lungs. They say he ain't got much show." Through the clouded odours of sickness and medicine rang the dauntless voice of the man in the corner. Section 2. Story 2. The Lone Charge of William B. Perkins. He could not distinguish between a 5-inch quick-firing gun and a nickel-plated ice pick, and so naturally he had been elected to fill the position of war correspondent. The responsible party was the editor of the Minnesota Herald. Perkins had no information of war and no particular rapidity of mind for acquiring it, but he had that rank and fibrous quality of courage which springs from the thick soil of Western America. It was morning in Guantanamo Bay. If the marines encamped on the hill had had time to turn their gaze seaward, they might have seen a small newspaper despatch boat wending its way toward the entrance of the harbour over the blue sunlit waters of the Caribbean. In the stern of this tug Perkins was seated upon some coal bags, while the breeze gently ruffled his greasy pyjamas. He was staring at a brown line of entrenchments surmounted by a flag, which was Camp McCalla. In the harbour were anchored 2 or 3 grim grey cruisers and a transport. As the tug steamed up the radiant channel, Perkins could see men moving on shore near the charred ruins of a village. Perkins was deeply moved. Here already was more war than he had ever known in Minnesota. Presently he, clothed in the essential garments of a war correspondent, was rowed to the sandy beach. Marines in yellow linen were handling an ammunition supply. They paid no attention to the visitor, being morose from the inconveniences of 2 days and nights of fighting. Perkins toiled up the zigzag path to the top of the hill, and looked with eager eyes at the trenches, the field pieces, the funny little Colts, the flag, the grim marines lying wearily on their arms. And still more, he looked through the clear air over 1,000 yards of mysterious woods, from which emanated at inopportune times repeated flocks of Mauser bullets. Perkins was delighted. He was filled with admiration for these jaded and smoky men who lay so quietly in the trenches, waiting for a resumption of guerilla enterprise. But he wished they would heed him. He wanted to talk about it. Save for sharp, inquiring glances, no one acknowledged his existence. Finally he approached 2 young lieutenants, and in his innocent Western way he asked them if they would like a drink. The effect on the 2 young lieutenants was immediate and astonishing. With one voice they answered, "Yes, we would." Perkins almost wept with joy at this amiable response, and he exclaimed that he would immediately board the tug and bring off a bottle of Scotch. This attracted the officers, and in a burst of confidence one explained that there had not been a drop in camp. Perkins lunged down the hill and fled to his boat, where in his exuberance he engaged in a preliminary altercation with some whisky. Consequently he toiled again up the hill in the blasting sun, with his enthusiasm in no ways abated. The parched officers were very gracious, and such was the state of mind of Perkins that he did not note properly how serious and solemn was his engagement with the whisky. And because of this fact, and because of his antecedents, there happened the lone charge of William B. Perkins. Now, as Perkins went down the hill, something happened. A private in those high trenches found that a cartridge was clogged in his rifle. It then becomes necessary with most kinds of rifles to explode the cartridge. The private took the rifle to his captain and explained the case. But it would not do in that camp to fire a rifle for mechanical purposes and without warning, because the eloquent sound would bring 600 tired marines to tension and high expectancy. So the captain turned and in a loud voice announced to the camp that he found it necessary to shoot into the air. The communication rang sharply from voice to voice. Then the captain raised the weapon and fired. Whereupon, a large line of guerillas lying in the bushes decided swiftly that their presence and position were discovered, and swiftly they volleyed. In a moment the woods and the hills were alive with the crack and sputter of rifles. Men on the warships in the harbour heard the old familiar flut flut fluttery flut 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 from the entrenchments. Incidentally, the launch of the Marblehead, commanded by one of our headlong American ensigns, streaked for the strategic woods like a galloping marine dragoon, peppering away with its blunderbuss in the bow. Perkins had arrived at the foot of the hill, where began the arrangement of 150 marines that protected the short line of communication between the main body and the beach. These men had all swarmed into line behind fortifications improvised from the boxes of provisions. and to them were gathering naked men who had been bathing, naked men who arrayed themselves speedily in cartridge belts and rifles. The woods and the hills went flut, flut, fluttery, flut, flut, fluttery, flut. Under the boughs of a beautiful tree lay 5 wounded men, thinking vividly. And now it befell Perkins to discover a Spaniard in the bush. The distance was some 500 yards. In a loud voice he announced his perception. He also declared hoarsely that if he only had a rifle he would go and possess himself of this particular enemy. Immediately an amiable lad shot in the arm said, "Well, take mine." Perkins thus acquired a rifle and a clip of 5 cartridges. "Come on," he shouted. This part of the battalion was lying very tight, not yet being engaged, but not knowing when the business would swirl around to them. To Perkins they replied with a roar, "Come back here, you fool! Do you want to get shot by your own crowd? Come back, !" As a detail it might be mentioned that the fire from a part of the hill swept the journey upon which Perkins had started. Now behold the solitary Perkins adrift in the storm of fighting, even as a champagne jacket of straw is lost in a great surf. He found it out quickly. 4 seconds elapsed before he discovered that he was an almshouse idiot plunging through hot, crackling thickets on a June morning in Cuba. Swing, singing, pop! Went the lightning swift metal grasshoppers over him and beside him. The beauties of rural Minnesota illuminated his conscience with the gold of lazy corn, with the sleeping green of meadows, with the cathedral gloom of pine forests. Swip, swing, pop! Perkins decided that if he cared to extract himself from a tangle of imbecility he must shoot. The entire situation was that he must shoot. It was necessary that he should shoot. Nothing would save him but shooting. It is a law that men thus decide when the waters of battle close over their minds. So, with a prayer that the Americans would not hit him in the back nor the left side, and that the Spaniards would not hit him in the front, he knelt like a supplicant alone in the desert of chaparral, and emptied his magazine at his Spaniard before he discovered that his Spaniard was a bit of dried palm branch. Then Perkins flurried like a fish. His reason for being was a Spaniard in the bush. When the Spaniard turned into a dried palm branch, he could no longer furnish himself with one adequate reason. Then did he dream frantically of some anthracite hiding place, some profound dungeon of peace, where blind mules live placidly, chewing the far gathered hay. Swing, bing, pop, prut, prut, prut. Then a field gun spoke. Boom, rah, swah, rah, 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 boom. Then a Colt automatic began to bark. Crack, 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 endlessly. Raked, enfiladed, flanked, surrounded, and overwhelmed, what hope was there for William B. Perkins of the Minnesota Herald? But war is a spirit. War provides for those that it loves. It provides sometimes death and sometimes a singular and incredible safety. There were few ways in which it was possible to preserve Perkins. One way was by means of a steam boiler. Perkins espied near him an old rusty steam boiler lying in the bushes. War only knows how it was there, but there it was, a temple shining resplendent with safety. With a moan of haste Perkins flung himself through that hole, which expressed the absence of the steam pipe. Then, ensconced in his boiler, Perkins comfortably listened to the ring of a fight which seemed to be in the air above him. Sometimes bullets struck their strong, swift blow against the boiler's sides, but none entered to interfere with Perkins' rest. Time passed. The fight, short anyhow, dwindled to prut, 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 prut. And when the silence came, Perkins might have been seen cautiously protruding from the boiler. Presently he strolled back toward the marine lines with his hat not able to fit his head for a few bumps of wisdom that were on it. The marines, with an annoyed air, were settling down again when an apparitional figure came from the bushes. There was great excitement. "It's that crazy man," they shouted, and as he drew near they gathered tumultuously about him and demanded to know how he had accomplished it. Perkins made a gesture, the gesture of a man escaping from an unintentional mud bath, the gesture of a man coming out of battle, and then he told them. The incredulity was immediate and general. "Yes, you did." "What? In an old boiler?" "An old boiler? Out in that brush? Well, we guess not." They did not believe him until 2 days later, when a patrol happened to find the rusty boiler, relic of some curious transaction in the ruin of the Cuban sugar industry. The patrol then marveled at the truthfulness of war correspondents until they were almost blind. Soon after his adventure, Perkins boarded the tug, wearing a countenance of poignant thoughtfulness. Section 3. The Clan of No Name, Parts 1 through 6. Unwind my riddle. Cruel as hawks the hours fly, Wounded men seldom come home to die. The hard waves see an arm flung high, Scorn hits strong because of a lie, Yet there exists a mystic tie. Unwind my riddle. She was out in the garden. Her mother came to her rapidly. "Margharita, Margharita, Mr. Smith is here. Come." Her mother was fat and commercially excited. Mr. Smith was a matter of some importance to all Tampa people, and since he was really in love with Margharita, he was distinctly of more importance to this particular household. Palm trees tossed their sprays over the fence toward the rutted sand of the street. A little foolish fish pond in the centre of the garden emitted a sound of red fins flipping, flipping. "No, mamma," said the girl. "Let Mr. Smith wait. I like the garden in the moonlight." Her mother threw herself into that state of virtuous astonishment which is the weapon of her kind. "Margharita!" The girl evidently considered herself to be a privileged belle, for she answered quite carelessly, "Oh, let him wait." The mother threw abroad her arms with a semblance of great high-minded suffering and withdrew. Margharita walked alone in the moonlit garden. Also an electric light threw its shivering gleam over part of her parade. There was peace for a time. Then suddenly, through the faint brown palings, was struck an envelope white and square. Margharita approached this envelope with an indifferent stride. She hummed a silly air, she bore herself casually, but there was something that made her grasp it hard, a peculiar muscular exhibition not discernible to indifferent eyes. She did not clutch it, but she took it, simply took it in a way that meant everything, and to measure it by vision it was a picture of the most complete disregard. She stood straight for a moment, then she drew from her bosom a photograph and thrust it through the palings. She walked rapidly into the house. II. A man in garb of blue and white, something relating to what we call bed ticking, was seated in a curious little cupola on the top of a Spanish blockhouse. The blockhouse sided a white military road that curved away from the man's sight into a blur of trees. On all sides of him were fields of tall grass, studded with palms and lined with fences of barbed wire. The sun beat aslant through the trees, and the man sped his eyes deep into the dark tropical shadows that seemed velvet with coolness. These tranquil vistas resembled painted scenery in a theatre, and, moreover, a hot, heavy silence lay upon the land. The soldier in the watching place leaned an unclean Mauser rifle in a corner, and reaching down, took a glowing coal on a bit of palm bark handed up to him by a comrade. The men below were mainly asleep. The sergeant in command drowsed near the open door, the arm above his head, showing his long, keen angled chevrons attached carelessly with safety pins. The sentry lit his cigarette and puffed languorously. Suddenly he heard from the air around him the querulous, deadly swift spit of rifle bullets, and an instant later the poppety pop of a small volley sounded in his face, close, as if it were fired only 10 feet away. Involuntarily he threw back his head quickly, as if he were protecting his nose from a falling tile. He screamed in alarm and fell into the blockhouse. In the gloom of it, men, with their breaths coming sharply between their teeth, were tumbling wildly for positions at the loopholes. The door had been slammed, but the sergeant lay just within, propped up as when he drowsed, but now with blood flowing steadily over the hand that he pressed flatly to his chest. His face was in stark yellow agony. He chokingly repeated: "Fuego, por Dios, hombres!" The men's ill-conditioned weapons were jammed through the loopholes, and they began to fire from all 4 sides of the blockhouse, from the simple data, apparently, that the enemy were in the vicinity. The fumes of burnt powder grew stronger and stronger in the little square fortress. The rattling of the magazine locks was incessant, and the interior might have been that of a gloomy manufactory if it were not for the sergeant down under the feet of the men, coughing out: "Por Dios, hombres, por Dios, fuego!" 3. A string of 5 Cubans in linen that had turned earthy brown in colour slid through the woods at a pace that was neither a walk nor a run. It was a kind of rack. In fact, the whole manner of the men, as they thus moved, bore a rather comic resemblance to the American pacing horse. But they had come many miles since sunup over mountainous and half-marked paths, and were plainly still fresh. The men were all practicals, guides. They made no sound in their swift travel, but moved their half-shod feet with the skill of cats. The woods lay around them in a deep silence such as one might find at the bottom of a lake. Suddenly the leading practico raised his hand. The others pulled up short and dropped the butts of their weapons calmly and noiselessly to the ground. The leader whistled a low note, and immediately another practico appeared from the bushes. He moved close to the leader without a word, and then they spoke in whispers. "There are 20 men and a sergeant in the blockhouse." "And the road?" "1 company of cavalry passed to the east this morning at 7 o'clock. They were escorting 4 carts. An hour later 1 horseman rode swiftly to the westward. About noon 10 infantry soldiers with a corporal were taken from the big fort and put in the first blockhouse to the east of the fort. There were already 12 men there. We saw a Spanish column moving up toward Mariel." "No more?" "No more." "Good. But the cavalry?" "It is all right. They were going a long march." "The expedition is a half league behind. Go and tell the general." The scout disappeared. The 5 other men lifted their guns and resumed their rapid and noiseless progress. A moment later no sound broke the stillness save the thump of a mango as it dropped lazily from its tree to the grass. So strange had been the apparition of these men, their dress had been so allied in colour to the soil, their passing had so little disturbed the solemn rumination of the forest, and their going had been so like a spectral dissolution, that a witness would have wondered if he had dreamed. 4. A small expedition had landed with arms from the United States, and had now come out of the hills and to the edge of a wood. Before them was a long grassed, rolling prairie marked with palms. A half-mile away was the military road, and they could see the top of a blockhouse. The insurgent scouts were moving somewhere off in the grass. The general sat comfortably under a tree, while his staff of 3 young officers stood about him, chatting. Their linen clothing was notable from being distinctly whiter than those of the men who, 150 in number, lay on the ground, in a long brown fringe, ragged. indeed bare in many places, but singularly reposeful, unworried, veteran like. The general, however, was thoughtful. He pulled continually at his little thin moustache. As far as the heavily patrolled and guarded military road was concerned, the insurgents had been in the habit of dashing across it in small bodies whenever they pleased, but to safely scoot over it with a valuable convoy of arms was decidedly a more important thing. So the general awaited the return of his practicos with anxiety. The still pampas betrayed no sign of their existence. The general gave some orders, and an officer counted off 20 men to go with him and delay any attempt of the troop of cavalry to return from the eastward. It was not an easy task, but it was a familiar task, checking the advance of a greatly superior force by a very hard fire from concealment. A few rifles had often bayed a strong column for sufficient length of time for all strategic purposes. The 20 men pulled themselves together tranquilly. They looked quite indifferent. Indeed, they had the supremely casual manner of old soldiers, hardened to battle as a condition of existence. 30 men were then told off, whose function it was to worry and rag at the blockhouse and check any advance from the westward. 100 men, carrying precious burdens, besides their own equipment, were to pass in as much of a rush as possible between these two wings, cross the road and skip for the hills, their retreat being covered by a combination of the two firing parties. It was a trick that needed both luck and neat arrangement. Spanish columns were forever prowling through this province in all directions and at all times. Insurgent bands, the lightest of light infantry, were kept on the jump, even when they were not incommoded by 50 boxes, each one large enough for the coffin of a small man, and heavier than if the little man were in it, and 50 small but formidable boxes of ammunition. The carriers stood to their boxes, and the firing parties leaned on their rifles. The general arose and strolled to and fro, his hands behind him. 2 of his staff were jesting at the third, a young man with a face less bronzed and with very new accoutrements. On the strap of his cartouche were a gold star and a silver star placed in a horizontal line, denoting that he was a second lieutenant. He seemed very happy. He laughed at all their jests, although his eye roved continually over the sunny grasslands, where was going to happen his first fight. One of his stars was bright, like his hopes, the other was pale, like death. 2 practicos came racking out of the grass. They spoke rapidly to the general. He turned and nodded to his officers. The 2 firing parties filed out and diverged toward their positions. The general watched them through his glasses. It was strange to note how soon they were dim to the unaided eye. The little patches of brown in the green grass did not look like men at all. Practicos continually ambled up to the general. Finally he turned and made a sign to the bearers. The first 20 men in line picked up their boxes, and this movement rapidly spread to the tail of the line. The weighted procession moved painfully out upon the sunny prairie. The general, marching at the head of it, glanced continually back as if he were compelled to drag behind him some ponderous iron chain. Besides the obvious mental worry, his face bore an expression of intense physical strain, and he even bent his shoulders, unconsciously tugging at the chain to hurry it through this enemy-crowded valley. 5. The fight was opened by 8 men who snuggled in the grass within 300 yards of the blockhouse, suddenly blazed away at the bed-ticking figure in the cupola and at the open door where they could see vague outlines. Then they laughed and yelled insulting language, for they knew that as far as the Spaniards were concerned, the surprise was as much as having a diamond bracelet turned to soap. It was this volley that smote the sergeant and caused the man in the cupola to scream and tumble from his perch. The 8 men, as well as all the other insurgents within fair range, had chosen good positions for lying close, and for a time they let the blockhouse rage, although the soldiers therein could occasionally hear, above the clamour of their weapons, shrill and almost wolfish calls coming from men whose lips were laid against the ground. But it is not in the nature of them of Spanish blood and armed with rifles to long endure the sight of anything so tangible as an enemy's blockhouse without shooting at it, other conditions being partly favourable. Presently the steaming soldiers in the little fort could hear the spring and shiver of bullets striking the wood that guarded their bodies. A perfectly white smoke floated up over each firing Cuban, the penalty of the Remington rifle, but about the blockhouse there was only the lightest gossamer of blue. The blockhouse stood always for some big, clumsy, and rather incompetent animal, while the insurgents, scattered on two sides of it, were little enterprising creatures of another species, too wise to come too near, but joyously raging at its easiest flanks and drilling the lead into its sides in a way to make it fume and spit and rave like the tomcat when the glad, free band foxhound pups catch him in the lane. The men, outlying in the grass, chuckled deliriously at the fury of the Spanish fire. They howled opprobrium to encourage the Spaniards to fire more ill-used, incapable bullets. Whenever an insurgent was about to fire, he ordinarily prefixed the affair with a speech. "Do you want something to eat? Yes? All right. Bang! Eat that!" The more common expressions of the incredibly foul Spanish tongue were trifles light as air in this badinage, which was shrieked out from the grass during the spin of bullets and the dull rattle of the shooting. But at some time there came a series of sounds from the east that began in a few disconnected pruts and ended as if an amateur was trying to play the long roll upon a muffled drum. Those of the insurgents in the blockhouse attacking party, who had neighbours in the grass, turned and looked at them seriously. They knew what the new sound meant. It meant that the 20 men who had gone to the eastward were now engaged. A column of some kind was approaching from that direction, and they knew by the clatter that it was a solemn occasion. In the first place they were now on the wrong side of the road. They were obliged to cross it to rejoin the main body, provided, of course, that the main body succeeded itself in crossing it. To accomplish this, the party at the blockhouse would have to move to the eastward until out of sight or good range of the maddened little fort. But, judging from the heaviness of the firing, the party of 20 who protected the east were almost sure to be driven immediately back. Hence travel in that direction would become exceedingly hazardous. Hence a man looked seriously at his neighbour. It might easily be that in a moment they were to become an isolated force and woefully on the wrong side of the road. Any retreat to the westward was absurd, since primarily they would have to widely circle the blockhouse, and more than that, they could hear, even now in that direction, Spanish bugle calling to Spanish bugle, far and near, until one would think that every man in Cuba was a trumpeter, and had come forth to parade his talent. 6. The insurgent general stood in the middle of the road, gnawing his lips. Occasionally he stamped a foot and beat his hands passionately together. The carriers were streaming past him, patient, sweating fellows, bowed under their burdens, but they could not move fast enough for him when others of his men were engaged both to the east and to the west, and he, too, knew from the sound that those to the east were in a sore way. Moreover, he could hear that accursed bugling, bugling, bugling in the west. He turned suddenly to the new lieutenant who stood beside him, pale and quiet. "Did you ever think 100 men were so many?" he cried, incensed to the point of beating them. Then he said longingly, "Oh, for a half hour, or even 20 minutes." A practico racked violently up from the east. It is characteristic of these men that, although they take a certain roadster gait and hold it forever, they cannot really run, sprint, race. "Captain Rodriguez is attacked by 200 men, señor, and the cavalry is behind them. He wishes to know—" The general was furious. He pointed. "Go! Tell Rodriguez to hold his place for 20 minutes, even if he leaves every man dead." The practico shambled hastily off. The last of the carriers were swarming across the road. The rifle drumming in the east was swelling out and out, evidently coming slowly nearer. The general bit his nails. He wheeled suddenly upon the young lieutenant. "Go to Bas at the blockhouse. Tell him to hold the devil himself for 10 minutes, and then bring his men out of that place." The long line of bearers was crawling like a dun worm toward the safety of the foot hills. High bullets sang a faint song over the aide as he saluted. The bugles had in the west ceased, and that was more ominous than bugling. It meant that the Spanish troops were about to march, or perhaps that they had marched. The young lieutenant ran along the road until he came to the bend which marked the range of sight from the blockhouse. He drew his machete, his stunning new machete, and hacked feverishly at the barbed wire fence which lined the north side of the road at that point. The first wire was obdurate, because it was too high for his stroke, but 2 more cut like candy, and he stepped over the remaining one, tearing his trousers in passing on the lively serpentine ends of the severed wires. Once out in the field and bullets seemed to know him and call for him and speak their wish to kill him. But he ran on, because it was his duty and because he would be shamed before men if he did not do his duty, and because he was desolate out there all alone in the fields with death. A man running in this manner from the rear was in immensely greater danger than those who lay snug and close, but he did not know it. He thought because he was 500, 450, 400 yards away from the enemy, and the others were only 300 yards away, that they were in far more peril. He ran to join them because of his opinion. He did not care to do it, but he thought that was what men of his kind would do in such a case. There was a standard and he must follow it, obey it, because it was a monarch, the prince of conduct. A bewildered and alarmed face raised itself from the grass, and a voice cried to him, "Drop, Manolo, drop, drop!" He recognized Bas and flung himself to the earth beside him. "Why," he said, panting, "what's the matter?" "Matter?" said Bas. "You are one of the most desperate and careless officers I know. When I saw you coming I wouldn't have given a peseta for your life." "Oh, no," said the young aide. Then he repeated his orders rapidly. But he was hugely delighted. He knew Bas well. Bas was a pupil of Maceo. Bas invariably led his men. He never was a mere spectator of their battle. He was known for it throughout the western end of the island. The new officer had early achieved a part of his ambition, to be called a brave man by established brave men. "Well, if we get away from here quickly it will be better for us," said Bas bitterly. "I've lost 6 men killed and more wounded. Rodriguez can't hold his position there, and in a little time more than 1,000 men will come from the other direction." He hissed a low call, and later the young aide saw some of the men sneaking off with the wounded, lugging them on their backs as porters carry sacks. The fire from the blockhouse had become a weary, and as the insurgent fire also slackened, Bas and the young lieutenant lay in the weeds listening to the approach of the eastern fight, which was sliding toward them like a door to shut them off. Bas groaned. "I leave my dead. Look there." He swung his hand in a gesture, and the lieutenant, looking, saw a corpse. He was not stricken as he expected. There was very little blood. It was a mere thing. "Time to travel," said Bas suddenly. His imperative hissing brought his men near him. There were a few hurried questions and answers. Then, characteristically, the men turned in the grass, lifted their rifles, and fired a last volley into the blockhouse, accompanying it with their shrill cries. Scrambling low to the ground, they were off in a winding line for safety. Breathing hard, the lieutenant stumbled his way forward. Behind him he could hear the men calling each to each: "Seke, seke, seke! Go on! Get out! Git!" Everybody understood that the peril of crossing the road was compounding from minute to minute. Section 3. The Clan of No Name, Parts 7-9. 7. When they reached the gap through which the expedition had passed, they fled out upon the road like scared wild fowl tracking along a sea beach. A cloud of blue figures far up this dignified, shaded avenue fired at once. The men already had begun to laugh as they shied one by one across the road. "Seke, seke!" The hard part for the nerves had been the lack of information of the amount of danger. Now that they could see it, they accounted it all the more lightly for their previous anxiety. Over in the other field, Bas and the young lieutenant found Rodriguez, his machete in one hand, his revolver in the other, smoky, dirty, sweating. He shrugged his shoulders when he saw them and pointed disconsolately to the brown thread of carriers moving toward the foothills. His own men were crouched in line just in front of him, blazing like a prairie fire. Now began the fight of a scant rear guard to hold back the pressing Spaniards until the carriers could reach the top of the ridge, a mile away. This ridge, by the way, was more steep than any roof. It conformed more to the sides of a French warship. Trees grew vertically from it, however, and a man burdened only with his rifle usually pulled himself wheezingly up in a sort of ladder climbing process, grabbing the slim trunks above him. How the loaded carriers were to conquer it in a hurry no one knew. Rodriguez shrugged his shoulders as one who would say with philosophy, smiles, tears, courage, "Isn't this a mess?" At an order, the men scattered back for 400 yards with the rapidity and mystery of a handful of pebbles flung in the night. They left one behind who cried out, but it was now a game in which some were sure to be left behind to cry out. The Spaniards deployed on the road and for 20 minutes remained there, pouring into a field such a fire from their magazines as was hardly heard at Gettysburg. As a matter of truth, the insurgents were at this time doing very little shooting, being chary of ammunition. But it is possible for the soldier to confuse himself with his own noise, and undoubtedly the Spanish troops thought throughout their din that they were being fiercely engaged. Moreover, a firing line, particularly at night or when opposed to a hidden foe, is nothing less than an emotional chord, a chord of a harp that sings because a puff of air arrives or when a bit of down touches it. This is always true of new troops or stupid troops, and these troops were rather stupid troops. But the way in which they mowed the verdure in the distance was a sight for a farmer. Presently the insurgents slunk back to another position where they fired enough shots to stir again the Spaniards into an opinion that they were in a heavy fight. But such a misconception could only endure for a number of minutes. Presently it was plain that the Spaniards were about to advance, and, moreover, word was brought to Rodriguez that a small band of guerillas were already making an attempt to worm around the right flank. Rodriguez cursed despairingly. He sent both Bas and the young lieutenant to that end of the line to hold the men to their work as long as possible. In reality, the men barely needed the presence of their officers. The kind of fighting left practically everything to the discretion of the individual, and they arrived at concert of action mainly because of the equality of experience in the wisdoms of bushwhacking. The yells of the guerillas could plainly be heard, and the insurgents answered in kind. The young lieutenant found desperate work on the right flank. The men were raving mad with it, babbling, tearful, almost frothing at the mouth. Two terrible, bloody creatures passed him, creeping on all fours, and one in a whimper was calling upon God, his mother, and a saint. The guerillas, as effectually concealed as the insurgents, were driving their bullets low through the smoke at sight of a flame, a movement of the grass, or sight of a patch of dirty brown coat. They were no column of four soldiers. They were as slinky and snaky and quick as so many Indians. They were, moreover, native Cubans, and because of their treachery to the One Star Flag they never by any chance received quarter if they fell into the hands of the insurgents. Nor, if the case was reversed, did they ever give quarter. It was life and life, death and death. There was no middle ground, no compromise. If a man's crowd was rapidly retreating and he was tumbled over by a slight hit, he should curse the sacred graves that the wound was not through the precise centre of his heart. The machete is a fine broad blade, but it is not so nice as a drilled hole in the chest. No man wants his deathbed to be a shambles. The men fighting on the insurgents' right knew that if they fell they were lost. On the extreme right the young lieutenant found 5 men in a little saucer-like hollow. 2 were dead, 1 was wounded and staring blankly at the sky, and 2 were emptying hot rifles furiously. Some of the guerillas had snaked into positions only 100 yards away. The young man rolled in among the men in the saucer. He could hear the barking of the guerillas and the screams of the 2 insurgents. The rifles were popping and spitting in his face, it seemed, while the whole land was alive with the noise of rolling and drumming. Men could have gone drunken in all this flashing and flying and snarling and din, but at this time he was very deliberate. He knew that he was thrusting himself into a trap whose door, once closed, opened only when the Black Hand knocked and every part of him seemed to be in panic-stricken revolt. But something controlled him. Something moved him inexorably in one direction. He perfectly understood that he was only sad, sad with a serene dignity, with the countenance of a mournful young prince. He was of a kind, that seemed to be it, and the men of his kind, on peak or plain, from the dark northern ice fields to the hot wet jungles, through all wine and want, through all lies and unfamiliar truth, dark or light, the men of his kind were governed by their gods, and each man knew the law and yet could not give tongue to it, but it was the law, and if the spirits of the men of his kind were all sitting in critical judgment upon him even then in the sky, he could not have bettered his conduct. He needs must obey the law, and always with the law there is only one way. But from peak and plain, from dark northern ice fields and hot wet jungles, through wine and want, through all lies and unfamiliar truth, dark or light, he heard breathed to him the approval and the benediction of his brethren. He stooped and gently took a dead man's rifle and some cartridges. The battle was hurrying, 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 but he was in no haste. His glance caught the staring eye of the wounded soldier, and he smiled at him quietly. The man, simple, doomed peasant, was not of his kind, but the law on fidelity was clear. He thrust a cartridge into the Remington and crept up beside the 2 unhurt men. Even as he did so, 3 or 4 bullets cut so close to him that all his flesh tingled. He fired carefully into the smoke. The guerillas were certainly not now more than 50 yards away. He raised him coolly for his second shot, and almost instantly it was as if some giant had struck him in the chest with a beam. It whirled him in a great spasm back into the saucer. As he put his 2 hands to his breast, he could hear the guerillas screeching exultantly, every throat vomiting forth all the infamy of a language prolific in the phrasing of infamy. One of the other men came rolling slowly down the slope, while his rifle followed him, and striking another rifle, clanged out. Almost immediately the survivor howled and fled wildly. A whole volley missed him, and then one or more shots caught him as a bird is caught on the wing. The young lieutenant's body seemed galvanized from head to foot. He concluded that he was not hurt very badly, but when he tried to move he found that he could not lift his hands from his breast. He had turned to lead. He had had a plan of taking a photograph from his pocket and looking at it. There was a stir in the grass at the edge of the saucer, and a man appeared there, looking where lay the four insurgents. His negro face was not an eminently ferocious one in its lines, but now it was lit with an illimitable blood greed. He and the young lieutenant exchanged a singular glance, then he came stepping eagerly down. The young lieutenant closed his eyes, for he did not want to see the flash of the machete. 8. The Spanish colonel was in a rage, and yet immensely proud, and yet in a rage of disappointment. There had been a fight, and the insurgents had retreated, leaving their dead. But still a valuable expedition had broken through his lines and escaped to the mountains. As a matter of truth, he was not sure whether to be wholly delighted or wholly angry, for well he knew that the importance lay not so much in the truthful account of the action as it did in the heroic prose of the official report, and in the fight itself lay material for a purple, splendid poem. The insurgents had run away. No one could deny it. It was plain even to whatever privates had fired with their eyes shut. This was worth a loud blow and splutter. However, when all was said and done, he could not help but reflect that if he had captured this expedition he would have been a brigadier general, if not more. He was a short, heavy man with a beard, who walked in a manner common to all elderly Spanish officers and to many young ones. That is to say, he walked as if his spine was a stick and a little longer than his body, as if he suffered from some disease of the backbone, which allowed him but scant use of his legs. He toddled along the road, gesticulating disdainfully and muttering "Ça! Ça! Ça!" He berated some soldiers for an immaterial thing, and as he approached the men stepped precipitately back as if he were a fire engine. They were most of them young fellows, who displayed, when under orders, the manner of so many faithful dogs. At present they were black, tongue-hanging, thirsty boys, bathed in the nervous weariness of the after-battle time. Whatever he may truly have been in character, the colonel closely resembled a gluttonous and libidinous old pig, filled from head to foot with the pollution of a sinful life. "Ça!" he snarled as he toddled. "Ça! Ça!" The soldiers saluted as they backed to the side of the road. The air was full of the odor of burnt rags. Over on the prairie, guerillas and regulars were rummaging the grass. A few unimportant shots sounded from near the base of the hills. A guerilla, glad with plunder, came to a Spanish captain. He held in his hand a photograph. "Mira, señor, I took this from the body of an officer whom I killed machete to machete." The captain shot from the corner of his eye a cynical glance at the guerilla, a glance which commented upon the last part of the statement. "H'm," he said. He took the photograph and gazed with a slow, faint smile, the smile of a man who knows bloodshed and homes and love, at the face of a girl. He turned the photograph presently, and on the back of it was written: "One lesson in English I will give you, this: I love you, Margarita." The photograph had been taken in Tampa. The officer was silent for a half minute, while his face still wore the slow, faint smile. "Pobrecito!" he murmured finally, with a philosophic sigh, which was brother to a shrug. Without deigning a word to the guerilla, he thrust the photograph in his pocket and walked away. High over the green earth in the dizzy blue heights some great birds were slowly circling with down-turned beaks. IX. Margharita was in the gardens. The blue electric rays shone through the plumes of the palm and shivered in feathery images on the walk. In the little foolish fish pond some stalwart fish was apparently bullying the others, for often there sounded a frantic splashing. Her mother came to her rapidly. "Margharita, Mr. Smith is here. Come." "Oh, is he?" cried the girl. She followed her mother to the house. She swept into the little parlour with a grand air, the egotism of a savage. Smith had heard the whirl of her skirts in the hall, and his heart, as usual, thumped hard enough to make him gasp. Every time he called he would sit waiting with the dull fear in his breast that her mother would enter and indifferently announce that she had gone up to heaven or off to New York with one of his dream rivals, and he would never see her again in this wide world. And he would conjure up tricks to then escape from the house without any one observing his face break up into furrows. It was part of his love to believe in the absolute treachery of his adored one. So, whenever he heard the whirl of her skirts in the hall, he felt that he had again leased happiness from a dark fate. She was rosily beaming and all in white. "Why, Mr. Smith!" she exclaimed, as if he was the last man in the world she expected to see. "Good evenin'," he said, shaking hands nervously. He was always awkward and unlike himself at the beginning of one of these calls. It took him some time to get into form. She posed her figure in operatic style on a chair before him, and immediately galloped off a mile of questions, information of herself, gossip, and general outcries, which left him no obligation but to look beamingly intelligent and from time to time say "Yes." His personal joy, however, was to stare at her beauty. When she stopped and wandered as if uncertain which way to talk, there was a minute of silence, which each of them had been educated to feel was very incorrect indeed. Polite people always babbled at each other like two brooks. He knew that the responsibility was upon him, and although his mind was mainly upon the form of the proposal of marriage which he intended to make later, it was necessary that he should maintain his reputation as a well-bred man by saying something at once. It flashed upon him to ask, "Won't you please play?" But the time for the piano ruse was not yet. It was too early. So he said the first thing that came into his head. "Too bad about young Manolo Prat being killed over there in Cuba, wasn't it?" "Wasn't it a pity?" she answered. "They say his mother is heartbroken," he continued. "They're afraid she's goin' to die." "And wasn't it queer that we didn't hear about it for almost 2 months? Well, it's no use trying to get quick news from there." Presently they advanced to matters more personal, and she used upon him a series of star-like glances which rumpled him at once to squalid slavery. He gloated upon her, afraid, yet more avaricious than 1,000 misers. She fully comprehended. She laughed and taunted him with her eyes. She impressed upon him that she was like a will-o'-the-wisp, beautiful beyond compare, but impossible, almost impossible, at least very difficult, then again suddenly impossible. He was glum. He would never dare propose to this radiance. It was like asking to be Pope. A moment later there chimed into the room something that he knew to be a more tender note. The girl became dreamy as she looked at him. Her voice lowered to a delicious intimacy of tone. He leaned forward. He was about to outpour his bully-ragged soul in fine words when, presto, she was the most casual person he had ever laid eyes upon, and was asking him about the route of the proposed trolley line. But nothing short of a fire could stop him now. He grabbed her hand. "Margharita," he murmured gutturally, "I want you to marry me." She glared at him in the most perfect lie of astonishment. "What do you say?" He arose, and she thereupon arose also, and fled back a step. He could only stammer out her name; and thus they stood, defying the principles of the dramatic art. "I love you," he said at last. "How do I know you really, truly love me?" she said, raising her eyes timorously to his face, and this timorous glance, this one timorous glance, made him the superior person in an instant. He went forward as confident as a grenadier, and taking both her hands, kissed her. That night she took a stained photograph from her dressing table, and holding it over the candle, burned it to nothing, her red lips meanwhile parted with the intentness of her occupation. On the back of the photograph was written: "One lesson in English I will give you, this: I love you." For the word is clear only to the kind who on peak or plain, from dark northern ice fields to the hot wet jungles, through all wine and want, through lies and unfamiliar truth, dark or light, are governed by the unknown gods; and though each man knows the law, no man may give tongue to it. Section 6 Story 4 God Rest Ye, Merry Gentlemen. Little Nell, sometimes called the Blessed Damozel, was a war correspondent for the New York Eclipse, and at sea on the despatch boats he wore pajamas, and on shore he wore whatever fate allowed him, which clothing was in the main unsuitable to the climate. He had been cruising in the Caribbean on a small tug, awash always, habitable never, wildly looking for Cervera's fleet; although what he was going to do with 4 armoured cruisers and 2 destroyers in the event of his really finding them had not been explained by the managing editor. The cable instructions read: "Take tug, go find Cervera's fleet." If his unfortunate 9-knot craft should happen to find these great 20-knot ships, with their 2 spiteful and faster attendants, little Nell had wondered how he was going to lose them again. He had marvelled, both publicly and in secret, on the uncompromising asininity of managing editors at odd moments, but he had wasted little time. The Jefferson G. Johnson was already coaled, so he passed the word to his skipper, bought some tinned meats, cigars, and beer, and soon the Johnson sailed on her mission, tooting her whistle in graceful farewell to some friends of hers in the bay. So the Johnson crawled giddily to one wave height after another, and fell aslant into one valley after another for a longer period than was good for the hearts of the men, because the Johnson was merely a harbour tug with no architectural intention of parading the high seas, and the crew had never seen the decks all white water like a mere sunken reef. As for the cook, he blasphemed hopelessly hour in and hour out, meanwhile pursuing the equipment of his trade frantically from side to side of the galley. Little Nell dealt with a great deal of grumbling, but he knew it was not the real evil grumbling. It was merely the unhappy words of men who wished expression of comradeship for their wet, forlorn, half-starved lives, to which, they explained, they were not accustomed, and for which, they explained, they were not properly paid. Little Nell condoled and condoled without difficulty. He laid words of gentle sympathy before them, and smothered his own misery behind the face of a reporter of the New York Eclipse. But they tossed themselves in their cockleshell even as far as Martinique. They knew many races and many flags, but they did not find Cervera's fleet. If they had found that elusive squadron, this timid story would never have been written; there would probably have been a lyric. The Johnson limped one morning into the Mole St. Nicolas, and there Little Nell received this dispatch: "Can't understand your inaction. What are you doing with the boat? Report immediately. Fleet transports already left Tampa. Expected destination near Santiago. Proceed there immediately. Place yourself under orders. Rogers Eclipse." One day, steaming along the high, luminous blue coast of Santiago province, they fetched into view the fleets, a knot of masts and funnels, looking incredibly inshore, as if they were glued to the mountains. Then mast left mast, and funnel left funnel, slowly, slowly, and the shore remained still, but the fleets seemed to move out toward the eager Johnson. At the speed of 9 knots an hour the scene separated into its parts. On an easily rolling sea, under a crystal sky, black hulled transports, erstwhile packets, lay waiting, while grey cruisers and gunboats lay near shore, shelling the beach and some woods. From their grey sides came thin red flashes, belches of white smoke, and then over the waters sounded boom, 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 boom. The crew of the Jefferson G. Johnson forgave Little Nell all the suffering of a previous fortnight. To the westward, about the mouth of Santiago harbor, sat a row of castellated grey battleships, their eyes turned another way, waiting. The Johnson swung past a transport whose decks and rigging were aswarm with black figures, as if a tribe of bees had alighted upon a log. She swung past a cruiser, indignant at being left out of the game, her deck thick with white clothed tars watching the play of their luckier brethren. The cold, blue, lifting seas tilted the big ships easily, slowly, and heaved the little ones in the usual sinful way, as if very little babes had surreptitiously mounted 16-hand trotting hunters. The Johnson leered and tumbled her way through a community of ships. The bombardment ceased, and some of the troop ships edged in near the land. Soon boats black with men and towed by launches were almost lost to view in the scintillant mystery of light which appeared where the sea met the land. A disembarkation had begun. The Johnson sped on at her 9 knots, and Little Nell chafed exceedingly, gloating upon the shore through his glasses, anon glancing irritably over the side to note the efforts of the excited tug. Then at last they were in a sort of a cove, with troop ships, newspaper boats, and cruisers on all sides of them, and over the water came a great hum of human voices, punctuated frequently by the clang of engine room gongs as the steamers manoeuvred to avoid jostling. In reality it was the great moment, the moment for which men, ships, islands, and continents had been waiting for months. But somehow it did not look it. It was very calm. A certain strip of high, green, rocky shore was being rapidly populated from boat after boat. That was all. Like many preconceived moments, it refused to be supreme. But nothing lessened Little Nell's frenzy. He knew that the army was landing. He could see it. And little did he care if the great moment did not look its part. It was his virtue as a correspondent to recognize the great moment in any disguise. The Johnson lowered a boat for him, and he dropped into it swiftly, forgetting everything. However, the mate, a bearded philanthropist, flung after him a mackintosh and a bottle of whisky. Little Nell's face was turned towards those other boats, filled with men, all eyes upon the placid, gentle, noiseless shore. Little Nell saw many soldiers seated stiffly beside upright rifle barrels, their blue breasts crossed with white shelter tent and blanket rolls. Launches screeched, jack tars pushed or pulled with their boat hooks, a beach was alive with working soldiers, some of them stark naked. Little Nell's boat touched the shore amid a babel of tongues, dominated at that time by a single stern voice which was repeating, "Fall in, B Company." He took his mackintosh and his bottle of whiskey and invaded Cuba. It was a trifle bewildering. Companies of those same men in blue and brown were being rapidly formed and marched off across a little open space, near a pool, near some palm trees, near a house, into the hills. At one side a mulatto in dirty linen and an old straw hat was hospitably using a machete to cut open some green cocoanuts for a group of idle invaders. At the other side, up a bank, a blockhouse was burning furiously, while near it some railway sheds were smouldering, with a little Rogers engine standing amid the ruins, grey, almost white, with ashes until it resembled a ghost. Little Nell dodged the encrimsoned blockhouse and proceeded where he saw a little village street lined with flimsy wooden cottages. Some ragged Cuban cavalrymen were tranquilly tending their horses in a shed which had not yet grown cold of the Spanish occupation. 3 American soldiers were trying to explain to a Cuban that they wished to buy drinks. A native rode by, clubbing his pony, as always. The sky was blue. The sea talked with a gravelly accent at the feet of some rocks. Upon its bosom the ships sat quiet as gulls. There was no mention, directly, of invasion for war, save in the roar of the flames at the blockhouse. But none even heeded this conflagration, excepting to note that it threw out a great heat. It was warm, very warm. It was really hard for Little Nell to keep from thinking of his own affairs, his debts, other misfortunes, loves, prospects of happiness. Nobody was in a flurry. The Cubans were not tearfully grateful. The American troops were visibly glad of being released from those ill transports, and the men often asked, with interest, "Where's the Spaniards?" And yet it must have been a great moment. It was a great moment. It seemed made to prove that the emphatic time of history is not the emphatic time of the common man, who throughout the change of nations feels an itch on his shin, a pain in his head, hunger, thirst, a lack of sleep. The influence of his memory of past firesides, glasses of beer, girls, theatres, ideals, religions, parents, faces, hurts, joy. Little Nell was hailed from a comfortable veranda, and, looking up, saw Walkley of the Eclipse stretched in a yellow and green hammock, smoking his pipe, with an air of having always lived in that house, in that village. "Oh, dear little Nell, how glad I am to see your angel face again. There, don't try to hide it. I can see it. Did you bring a corkscrew, too? You're superseded as master of the slaves. Did you know it? And by Rogers, too. Rogers is a Sadducee, a cadaver, and a pelican, appointed to the post of chief correspondent, no doubt, because of his rare gift of incapacity. Never mind." "Where is he now?" asked Little Nell, taking seat on the steps. "He is down interfering with the landing of the troops," answered Walkley, swinging a leg. "I hope you have the Johnson well stocked with food as well as with cigars, cigarettes and tobaccos, ales, wines and liquors. We shall need them. There is already famine in the house of Walkley. I have discovered that the system of transportation for our gallant soldiery does not strike in me the admiration which I have often felt when viewing the management of an ordinary bun shop. A hunger, stifling, jammed together amid odours, and everybody irritable, ye gods, how irritable! And so look!" The Jefferson G. Johnson, well known to them at an incredible distance, could be seen striding the broad sea, the smoke belching from her funnel, headed for Jamaica. "The army lands in Cuba!" shrieked Walkley. "Shafter's army lands near Santiago. Special type. Half the front page. Oh, the Sadducee, the cadaver, the pelican!" Little Nell was dumb with astonishment and fear. Walkley, however, was at least not dumb. "That's the Pelican. That's Mr. Rogers making his first impression upon the situation. He has engraved himself upon us. We are tattooed with him. There will be a fight to morrow, sure, and we will cover it even as you found Cervera's fleet. No food, no horses, no money. I am transport lame. You are sea weak. We will never see our salaries again. Whereby Rogers is a fool." "Anybody else here?" asked Little Nell wearily. "Only young Point." Point was an artist on the Eclipse. "But he has nothing. Pity there wasn't an almshouse in this God forsaken country. Here comes Point now." A sad faced man came along, carrying much luggage. "Hello, Point. Lithographer and genius. Have you food?" "Food? Well, then, you had better return yourself to Tampa by wire. You are no good here. Only one more little mouth to feed." Point seated himself near Little Nell. "I haven't had anything to eat since daybreak," he said gloomily. "And I don't care much, for I am simply dog tired." "Don't tell me you are dog tired, my talented friend," cried Walkley from his hammock. "Think of me. And now what's to be done?" They stared for a time disconsolately at where, over the rim of the sea, trailed black smoke from the Johnson. From the landing place below and to the right came the howls of a man who was superintending the disembarkation of some mules. The burning blockhouse still rendered its hollow roar. Suddenly the men-crowded landing set up its cheer, and the steamers all whistled long and raucously. Tiny black figures were raising an American flag over a blockhouse on the top of a great hill. "That's mighty fine Sunday stuff," said Little Nell. "Well, I'll go and get the order in which the regiments landed, and who was first ashore, and all that. Then I'll go and try to find General Lawton's headquarters. His division has got the advance, I think. And lo! I will write a burning description of the raising of the flag," said Walkley, "while the brilliant Point buskies for food, and makes damn sure he gets it," he added fiercely. Little Nell thereupon wandered over the face of the earth, threading out the story of the landing of the regiments. He only found about 50 men who had been the first American soldier to set foot on Cuba, and of these he took the most probable. The army was going forward in detail as soon as the pieces were landed. There was a house something like a crude country tavern. The soldiers in it were looking over their rifles and talking. There was a well of water quite hot, more palm trees, an inscrutable background. When he arrived again at Walkley's mansion, he found the veranda crowded with correspondents in khaki, duck, dungaree, and flannel. They wore riding breeches, but that was mainly forethought. They could see now that fate intended them to walk. Some were writing copy, while Walkley discoursed from his hammock. Rhodes, doomed to be shot in action some days later, was trying to borrow a canteen from men who had one, and from men who had none. Young Point, wan, utterly worn out, was asleep on the floor. Walkley pointed to him. That is how he appears after his foraging journey, during which he ran all Cuba through a sieve. Oh, yes, a can of corn and a half bottle of lime juice. "Say, does anybody know the name of the commander of the 26th Infantry?" "Who commands the 1st Brigade of Kent's Division?" "What was the name of the chap that raised the flag?" "What time is it?" And a woeful man was wandering here and there with a cold pipe, saying plaintively, "Who's got a match? Anybody here got a match?" Little Nell's left boot hurt him at the heel, and so he removed it, taking great care and whistling through his teeth. The heated dust was upon them all, making everybody feel that bathing was unknown and shattering their tempers. Young Point developed a snore which brought grim sarcasm from all quarters. Always below hummed the traffic of the landing place. When night came, Little Nell thought best not to go to bed until late, because he recognized the mackintosh as but a feeble comfort. The evening was a glory. A breeze came from the sea, fanning spurts of flame out of the ashes and charred remains of the sheds, while overhead lay a splendid summer night sky, aflash with great tranquil stars. In the streets of the village were two or three fires, frequently and suddenly reddening with their glare the figures of low voiced men who moved here and there. The lights of the transports blinked on the murmuring plain in front of the village, and far to the westward Little Nell could sometimes note a subtle indication of a playing search-light, which alone marked the presence of the invisible battleships, half mooned about the entrance of Santiago harbor, waiting, waiting, waiting. When Little Nell returned to the veranda, he stumbled along a man-strewn place, until he came to the spot where he left his mackintosh, but he found it gone. His curses mingled then with those of the men upon whose bodies he had trodden. Two English correspondents, lying awake to smoke a last pipe, reared and looked at him lazily. "What's wrong, old chap?" murmured one. Lost it, eh? Well, look here. Come here and take a bit of my blanket. It's a jolly big one. No trouble at all, man. There you are. Got enough? Comfy? Good night." A sleepy voice arose in the darkness. "If this hammock breaks, I shall hit at least 10 of those Indians down there. Never mind. This is war." The men slept. Once the sound of 3 or 4 shots rang across the windy night, and one head uprose swiftly from the veranda, 2 eyes looked dazedly at nothing, and the head as swiftly sank. Again a sleepy voice was heard. Usual thing, nervous sentries. The men slept. Before dawn a pulseless, penetrating chill came into the air, and the correspondents awakened, shivering, into a blue world. Some of the fires still smouldered. Walkley and Little Nell kicked vigorously into Point's framework. "Come on, Brilliance. Wake up, Talent. Don't be sodgering. It's too cold to sleep, but it's not too cold to hustle." Point sat up dolefully. Upon his face was a childish expression. "Where are we going to get breakfast?" he asked, sulking. "There's no breakfast for you, you hound. Get up and hustle." Accordingly they hustled. With exceeding difficulty they learned that nothing emotional had happened during the night, save the killing of 2 Cubans who were so secure in ignorance that they could not understand the challenge of 2 American sentries. Then Walkley ran a gamut of commanding officers, and Little Nell pumped privates for their impressions of Cuba. When his indignation at the absence of breakfast allowed him, Point made sketches. At the full break of day the Adolphus and Eclipse dispatch boat sent a boat ashore with Taylor and Shackles in it, and Walkley departed tearlessly for Jamaica, soon after he had bestowed upon his friends much tinned goods and blankets. "Well, we've got our stuff off," said Little Nell. "Now Point and I must breakfast." Shackles, for some reason, carried a great hunting knife, and with it Little Nell opened a tin of beans. "Fall to," he said amiably to Point. There were some hard biscuits. Afterwards they, the 4 of them, marched off on the route of the troops. They were well loaded with luggage, particularly young Point, who had somehow made a great gathering of unnecessary things. Hills covered with verdure soon enclosed them. They heard that the army had advanced some 9 miles with no fighting. Evidences of the rapid advance were here and there: coats, gauntlets, blanket rolls on the ground. Mule trains came herding back along the narrow trail to the sound of a little tinkling bell. Cubans were appropriating the coats and blanket rolls. The 4 correspondents hurried onward. The surety of impending battle weighed upon them always, but there was a score of minor things more intimate. Little Nell's left heel had chafed until it must have been quite raw, and every moment he wished to take a seat by the roadside and console himself from pain. Shackles and Point disliked each other extremely, and often they foolishly quarrelled over something or nothing. The blanket rolls and packages for the hand oppressed everybody. It was like being burned out of a boarding house and having to carry one's trunk 8 miles to the nearest neighbour. Moreover, Point, since he had stupidly overloaded, with great wisdom placed various cameras and other trifles in the hands of his 3 less burdened and more sensible friends. This made them fume and gnash, but in complete silence, since he was hideously youthful and innocent and unaware. They all wished to rebel, but none of them saw their way clear because they did not understand. But somehow it seemed a barbarous project. No one wanted to say anything, cursed him privately for a little ass, but said nothing. For instance, Little Nell wished to remark, "Point, you are not a thoroughbred in a half of a way. You are an inconsiderate, thoughtless little swine." But in truth, he said, "Point, when you started out you looked like a Christmas tree. If we keep on robbing you of your bundles there soon won't be anything left for the children." Point asked dubiously, "What do you mean?" Little Nell merely laughed with deceptive good nature. They were always very thirsty. There was always a howl for the half bottle of lime juice. 5 or 6 drops from it were simply heavenly in the warm water from the canteens. Point seemed to try to keep the lime juice in his possession in order that he might get more benefit of it. Before the war was ended, the others found themselves declaring vehemently that they loathed Point, and yet when men asked them the reason, they grew quite inarticulate. The reasons seemed then so small, so childish as the reasons of a lot of women, and yet at the time his offences loomed enormous. The surety of impending battle still weighed upon them. Then it came that Shackles turned seriously ill. Suddenly he dropped his own and much of Point's traps upon the trail, wriggled out of his blanket roll, flung it away, and took seat heavily at the roadside. They saw with surprise that his face was pale as death, and yet streaming with sweat. "Boys," he said in his ordinary voice, "I'm clean played out. I can't go another step. You fellows go on, and leave me to come as soon as I am able." "Oh, no, that wouldn't do at all," said Little Nell and Tailor together. Point moved over to a soft place and dropped, amid whatever traps he was himself carrying. "Don't know whether it's ancestral or merely from the sun, but I've got a stroke," said Shackles, and gently slumped over to a prostrate position before either Little Nell or Tailor could reach him. Thereafter Shackles was parental. It was Little Nell and Tailor who were really suffering from a stroke, either ancestral or from the sun. "Put my blanket roll under my head, Nell, me son," he said gently. "There now, that is very nice. It is delicious. Why, I'm all right, only tired." He closed his eyes and something like an easy slumber came over him. Once he opened his eyes. "Don't trouble about me," he remarked. But the two fussed about him, nervous, worried, discussing this plan and that plan. It was Point who first made a businesslike statement. Seated carelessly and indifferently upon his soft place, he finally blurted out, "Say, look here. Some of us have got to go on. We can't all stay here. Some of us have got to go on." It was quite true. The eclipse could take no account of strokes. In the end, Point and Tailor went on, leaving Little Nell to bring on Shackles as soon as possible. The latter two spent many hours in the grass by the roadside. They made numerous abrupt acquaintances with passing staff officers, privates, muleteers, many stopping to inquire the wherefore of the death-faced figure on the ground. Favours were done often and often, by peer and peasant, small things, of no consequence, and yet warming. It was dark when Shackles and Little Nell had come slowly to where they could hear the murmur of the army's bivouac. "Shack! gasped Little Nell to the man leaning forlornly upon him. "I guess we'd better bunk down here where we stand." "All right, old boy, anything you say," replied Shackles, in the bass and hollow voice which arrives with such condition. They crawled into some bushes and distributed their belongings upon the ground. Little Nell spread out the blankets and generally played housemaid. Then they lay down, supperless, being too weary to eat. The men slept. At dawn Little Nell awakened and looked wildly for Shackles, whose empty blanket was pressed flat like a wet newspaper on the ground. But at nearly the same moment Shackles appeared, elate. "Come on," he cried. "I've rustled an invitation for breakfast." Little Nell came on with celerity. "Where? Who?" he said. "Oh, some officers," replied Shackles airily. If he had been ill the previous day, he showed it now only in some curious kind of deference he paid to Little Nell. Shackles conducted his comrade, and soon they arrived at where a captain and his one subaltern arose courteously from where they were squatting near a fire of little sticks. They wore the wide white trouser stripes of infantry officers, and upon the shoulders of their blue campaign shirts were the little marks of their rank. But otherwise there was little beyond their manners to render them different from the men who were busy with breakfast near them. The captain was old, grizzled, a common type of captain in the tiny American army, overjoyed at the active service, confident of his business, and yet breathing out in some way a note of pathos. The war was come too late. Age was grappling him, and honours were only for his widow and his children, merely a better life insurance policy. He had spent his life policing Indians with much labour, cold and heat, but with no glory for him nor his fellows. All he could now do was to die at the head of his men. If he had youthfully dreamed of a general's stars, they were now impossible to him, and he knew it. He was too old to leap so far. His sole honour was a new invitation to face death. And yet, with his ambitions lying half strangled, he was going to take his men into any sort of holocaust, because his traditions were of gentlemen and soldiers, and because he loved it for itself, the thing itself, the whirl, the unknown. If he had been degraded at that moment to be a pot wrestler, no power could have starved him from going through the campaign as a spectator. Why, the army! It was in each drop of his blood. The lieutenant was very young. Perhaps he had been hurried out of West Point at the last moment upon a shortage of officers appearing. To him all was opportunity. He was, in fact, in great luck. Instead of going off in 1898 to grill for an indefinite period on some God-forsaken heap of red-hot sand in New Mexico, he was here in Cuba on real business with his regiment. When the big engagement came, he was sure to emerge from it either horizontally or at the head of a company, and what more could a boy ask? He was a very modest lad, and talked nothing of his frame of mind, but an expression of blissful contentment was ever upon his face. He really accounted himself the most fortunate boy of his time, and he felt almost certain that he would do well. It was necessary to do well. He would do well. And yet, in many ways, these two were alike. The grizzled captain with his gently mournful countenance, too late, and the elate young second lieutenant, his commission hardly dry. Here again it was the influence of the army. After all, they were both children of the army. It is possible to spring into the future here and chronicle what happened later. The captain, after 35 years of waiting for his chance, took his Mauser bullet through the brain at the foot of San Juan Hill in the very beginning of the battle. And the boy arrived on the crest panting, sweating, but unscratched, and not sure whether he commanded one company or a whole battalion. Thus fate dealt to the hosts of Shackles and Little Nell. The breakfast was of canned tomatoes stewed with hard bread, more hard bread, and coffee. It was very good fare, almost royal. Shackles and Little Nell were absurdly grateful as they felt the hot bitter coffee tingle in them. But they departed joyfully before the sun was fairly up and passed into Siboney. They never saw the captain again. The beach at Siboney was furious with traffic, even as had been the beach at Daiquiri. Launches shouted, jack tars prodded with their boat hooks, and load of men followed load of men. Straight, parade-like, on the shore stood a trumpeter playing familiar calls to the troop horses who swam towards him eagerly through the salt seas. Crowding closely into the cove were transport of all sizes and ages. To the left and to the right of the little landing beach green hills shot upward like the wings in a theatre. They were scarred here and there with blockhouses and rifle pits. Up one hill a regiment was crawling, seemingly inch by inch. Shackles and Little Nell walked among palms and scrubby bushes, near pools, over spaces of sand, holding little monuments of biscuit boxes, ammunition boxes, and supplies of all kinds. Some regiment was just collecting itself from the ships, and the men made great patches of blue on the brown sand. Shackles asked a question of a man accidentally: "Where's that regiment going to?" He pointed to the force that was crawling up the hill. The man grinned and said: "They're going to look for a fight." "Looking for a fight," said Shackles and Little Nell together. They stared into each other's eyes. Then they set off for the foot of the hill. The hill was long and toilsome. Below them spread wider and wider a vista of ships quiet on a grey sea. A busy black disembarkation place. Tall, still, green hills. A village of well separated cottages. Palms. A bit of road. Soldiers marching. They passed vacant Spanish trenches. Little 12-foot blockhouses. Soon they were on a fine upland near the sea. The path, under ordinary conditions, must have been a beautiful wooded way. It wound in the shade of thickets of fine trees, then through rank growths of bushes with revealed and fantastic roots, then through a grassy space which had all the beauty of a neglected orchard. But always from under their feet scuttled noisy land crabs, demons to the nerves, which in some way possessed a semblance of moon-like faces upon their blue or red bodies. And these faces were turned with expressions of deepest horror upon Shackles and Little Nell as they sped to overtake the pugnacious regiment. The route was paved with coats, hats, tent and blanket rolls, ration tins, haversacks, anything but ammunition belts, rifles, and canteens. They heard a dull noise of voices in front of them, men talking too loud for the etiquette of the forest, and presently they came upon 2 or 3 soldiers lying by the roadside, flame-faced, utterly spent from the hurried march in the heat. One man came limping back along the path. He looked to them anxiously for sympathy and comprehension. "Hurt my knee. I swear I couldn't keep up with the boys. I had to leave 'em. Wasn't that tough luck?" His collar rolled away from a red, muscular neck, and his bare forearms were better than stanchions. Yet he was almost babyishly tearful in his attempt to make the 2 correspondents feel that he had not turned back because he was afraid. They gave him scant courtesy, tinctured with 1 drop of sympathetic yet cynical understanding. Soon they overtook the hospital squad, men addressing chaste language to some pack mules, a talkative sergeant, 2 amiable, cool-eyed young surgeons. Soon they were amid the rear troops of the dismounted volunteer cavalry regiment which was moving to attack. The men strode easily along, arguing one to another on ulterior matters. If they were going into battle, they either did not know it, or they concealed it well. They were more like men going into a bar at 1 o'clock in the morning. Their laughter rang through the Cuban woods. And in the meantime, soft, mellow, sweet, sang the voice of the Cuban wood dove, the Spanish gorilla calling to his mate. Forest music. On the flanks, deep back on both flanks, the adorable wood dove singing only of love. Some of the advancing Americans said it was beautiful. It was beautiful. The Spanish gorilla called to his mate. What could be more beautiful? Shackles and Little Nell rushed precariously through waist-high bushes until they reached the center of the single-filed regiment. The firing then broke out in front. All the woods set up a hot sputtering, the bullets sped along the path and across it from both sides. The thickets presented nothing but dense masses of light green foliage, out of which these swift steel things were born supernaturally. It was a volunteer regiment going into its first action against an enemy of unknown force in a country where the vegetation was thicker than fur on a cat. There might have been a dreadful mess, but in military matters the only way to deal with a situation of this kind is to take it frankly by the throat and squeeze it to death. Shackles and Little Nell felt the thrill of the orders. "Come ahead, men! Keep right! Ahead, men! Come on!" The volunteer cavalry regiment, with all the willingness in the world, went ahead into the angle of V-shaped Spanish formation. It seemed that every leaf had turned into a soda bottle and was popping its cork. Some of the explosions seemed to be against the men's very faces, often against the backs of their necks. "Now, men, keep going ahead! Keep on going!" The forward troops were already engaged. They at least had something at which to shoot. "Now, Captain, if you're ready. Stop that swearing there. Got a match? Steady now, men." A gate appeared in a barbed wire fence. Within were billowy fields of long grass, dotted with palms and luxuriant mango trees. It was Elysian, a place for lovers, fair as Eden in its radiance of sun under its blue sky. One might have expected to see white-robed figures walking slowly in the shadows. A dead man with a bloody face lay twisted in a curious contortion at the waist. Some one was shot in the leg, his pins knocked cleanly from under him. "Keep going, men!" The air roared, and the ground fled reelingly under their feet. Light, shadow, trees, grass. Bullets spat from every side. Once they were in a thicket, and the men, blanched and bewildered, turned one way and then another, not knowing which way to turn. "Keep going, men!" Soon they were in the sunlight again. They could see the long, scant line which was being drained man by man, one might say drop by drop. The musketry rolled forth in a great full measure from the magazine carbines. "Keep going, men! Christ, I'm shot! They're flanking us, sir! We're being fired into by our own crowd, sir! Keep going, men!" A low ridge before them was a bottling establishment blowing up in detail. From the right, it seemed at that time to be the far right, they could hear steady, crashing volleys, the United States Regulars in action. Then suddenly, to use a phrase of the street, the whole bottom of the thing fell out. It was suddenly and mysteriously ended. The Spaniards had run away, and some of the regulars were chasing them. It was a victory. When the wounded men dropped in the tall grass, they quite disappeared, as if they had sunk in water. Little Nell and Shackles were walking along through the fields, disputing. "Well, damn it, man," cried Shackles, "we must get a list of the killed and wounded." "That is not nearly so important," quoth Little Nell academically, "as to get the first account to New York of the first action of the army in Cuba." They came upon Taylor lying with a bared torso and a small red hole through his left lung. He was calm, but evidently out of temper. "Good God, Taylor!" they cried, dropping to their knees like two pagans. "Are you hurt, old boy?" "Hurt?" he said gently. No, 'tis not so deep as a well, nor so wide as a church door, but 'tis enough, do you see? You understand, do you? Idiots!" Then he became very official. "Shackles, feel and see what's under my leg. It's a small stone or a burr or something. Don't be clumsy now. Be careful. Be careful." Then he said angrily, "Oh, you didn't find it at all, damn it!" In reality there was nothing there, and so Shackles could not have removed it. "Sorry, old boy," he said meekly. "Well, you may observe that I can't stay here more than a year," said Taylor, with some oratory, "and the hospital people have their own work in hand. It behooves you, Nell, to fly to Siboney, arrest a dispatch boat, get a cot and some things, and some minions to carry me. If I get once down to the base I'm all right, but if I stay here I'm dead. Meantime Shackles can stay here and try to look as if he liked it." There was no disobeying the man. Lying there with a little red hole in his left lung, he dominated them through his helplessness and through their fear that if they angered him he would move and bleed. "Well?" said Little Nell. "Yes," said Shackles, nodding. Little Nell departed. "That blanket you lent me," Taylor called after him, "is back there somewhere with Point." Little Nell noted that many of the men who were wandering among the wounded seemed so spent with the toil and excitement of their first action that they could hardly drag one leg after the other. He found himself suddenly in the same condition. His face, his neck, even his mouth felt dry as sun-baked bricks, and his legs were foreign to him. But he swung desperately into his 5-mile task. On the way he passed many things: bleeding men carried by comrades, others making their way grimly with encrimsoned arms, then the little settlement of the hospital squad, men on the ground everywhere, many in the path, one young captain dying with great gasps, his body pale blue and glistening like the inside of a rabbit's skin. But the voice of the Cuban wood dove, soft, mellow, sweet, singing only of love, was no longer heard from the wealth of foliage. Presently the hurrying correspondent met another regiment coming to assist, a line of 1,000 men in a single file through the jungle. "Well, how's it going, old man? How is it coming on? Are we doing 'em?" Then, after an interval, came other regiments, moving out. He had to take to the bush to let these long lines pass him, and he was delayed, and had to flounder amid brambles. But at last, like a successful pilgrim, he arrived at the brow of the great hill overlooking Siboney. His practised eye scanned the fine broad brow of the sea with its clustering ships, but he saw thereon no Eclipse dispatch boats. He zigzagged heavily down the hill, and arrived finally amid the dust and outcries of the base. He seemed to ask 1,000 men if they had seen an Eclipse boat on the water, or an Eclipse correspondent on the shore. They all answered no. He was like a poverty-stricken and unknown suppliant at a foreign court. Even his plea got only ill hearings. He had expected the news of the serious wounding of Taylor to appall the other correspondents, but they took it quite calmly. It was as if their sense of an impending great battle between two large armies had quite got them out of focus for these minor tragedies. Taylor was hurt, yes? They looked at Little Nell, dazed. How curious that Taylor should be almost the first. How very curious, yes. But as far as arousing them to any enthusiasm of active pity, it seemed impossible. He was lying up there in the grass, was he? Too bad, too bad, too bad. Little Nell went alone and lay down in the sand with his back against a rock. Taylor was prostrate up there in the grass. Never mind. Nothing was to be done. The whole situation was too colossal. Then into his zone came Walkley, the invincible. "Walkley!" yelled Little Nell. Walkley came quickly, and Little Nell lay weakly against his rock and talked. In 30 seconds Walkley understood everything, had hurled a drink of whisky into Little Nell, had admonished him to lie quiet, and had gone to organize and manipulate. When he returned he was a trifle dubious and backward. Behind him was a singular squad of volunteers from the Adolphus, carrying among them a wire woven bed. "Look here, Nell," said Walkley in bashful accents, "I've collected a battalion here which is willing to go bring Taylor, but they say you can't show them where he is?" "Yes," said Little Nell, arising. When the party arrived at Siboney and deposited Taylor in the best place, Walkley had found a house and stocked it with canned soups. Therein Shackles and Little Nell revelled for a time, and then rolled on the floor in their blankets. Little Nell tossed a great deal. "Oh, I'm so tired. Good God, I'm tired. I'm tired." In the morning a voice aroused them. It was a swollen, important circus voice saying, "Where is Mr. Nell? I wish to see him immediately." "Here I am, Rogers," cried Little Nell. "Oh, Nell," said Rogers, "here's a despatch to me which I thought you had better read." Little Nell took the despatch. It was: "Tell Nell can't understand his inaction. Tell him come home first steamer from Port Antonio, Jamaica." Section 5. The Revenge of the Adolphus, Parts 1-4. 1. "Stand by." Shackles had come down from the bridge of the Adolphus and flung this command at 3 fellow correspondents who in the galley were busy with pencils trying to write something exciting and interesting from 4 days' quiet cruising. They looked up casually. What for? They did not intend to arouse for nothing. Ever since Shackles had heard the men of the Navy directing each other to stand by for this thing and that thing, he had used the 2 words as his pet phrase, and was continually telling his friends to stand by. Sometimes its portentous and emphatic reiteration became highly exasperating, and men were apt to retort sharply, "Well, I am standing by, ain't I?" On this occasion they detected that he was serious. "Well, what for?" they repeated. In his answer Shackles was reproachful as well as impressive. "Stand by? Stand by for a Spanish gunboat. A Spanish gunboat in chase. Stand by for 2 Spanish gunboats, both of them in chase." The others looked at him for a brief space and were almost certain that they saw truth written upon his countenance. Whereupon they tumbled out of the galley and galloped up to the bridge. The cook, with a mere inkling of tragedy, was now out on deck bawling, "What's the matter? What's the matter? What's the matter?" Aft, the grimy head of a stoker was thrust suddenly up through the deck, so to speak. The eyes flashed in a quick look astern, and then the head vanished. The correspondents were scrambling on the bridge. "Where's my glasses, damn it? Here, let me take a look. Are they Spaniards, Captain? Are you sure?" The skipper of the Adolphus was at the wheel. The pilot house was so arranged that he could not see astern without hanging forth from one of the side windows, but apparently he had made early investigation. He did not reply at once. At sea he never replied at once to questions. At the very first, Shackles had discovered the merits of this deliberate manner, and had taken delight in it. He invariably detailed his talk with the captain to the other correspondents. "Look here, I've just been to see the skipper. I said I would like to put up into Cape Haytien." Then he took a little think. Finally he said, "All right." Then I said, "I suppose we'll need to take on more coal there?" He took another little think. I said, "Ever ran into that port before?" He took another little think. Finally he said, "Yes." I said, "Have a cigar?" He took another little think. "See? That's where I fooled 'em." While the correspondents spun the hurried questions at him, the captain of the Adolphus stood with his brown hands on the wheel and his cold glance aligned straight over the bow of his ship. "Are they Spanish gunboats, Captain? Are they, Captain?" After a profound pause, he said, "Yes." The four correspondents hastily and in perfect time presented their backs to him and fastened their gaze on the pursuing foe. They saw a dull grey curve of sea going to the feet of the high green and blue coast line of northeastern Cuba, and on this sea were two miniature ships with clouds of iron-coloured smoke pouring from their funnels. One of the correspondents strolled elaborately to the pilot house. "Aw, Captain," he drawled, "do you think they can catch us?" The captain's glance was still aligned over the bow of his ship. Ultimately he answered, "I don't know." From the top of the little Adolphus stack thick, dark smoke swept level for a few yards, and then went rolling to leeward in great, hot, obscuring clouds. From time to time the grimy head was thrust through the deck, the eyes took the quick look astern, and then the head vanished. The cook was trying to get somebody to listen to him. "Well, you know, damn it all, it won't be no fun to be ketched by them Spaniards. By God, it won't. Look here, what do you think they'll do to us, eh? Say, I don't like this, you know. I'm damned if I do." The sea, cut by the hurried bow of the Adolphus, flung its waters astern in the formation of a wide angle, and the lines of the angle ruffled and hissed as they fled, while the thumping screw tormented the water at the stern. The frame of the steamer underwent regular convulsions as in the strenuous sobbing of a child. The mate was standing near the pilot house. Without looking at him, the captain spoke his name. "Ed?" "Yes, sir," cried the mate with alacrity. The captain reflected for a moment. Then he said, "Are they gaining on us?" The mate took another anxious survey of the race. "Yes, I think they are, a little." After a pause the captain said, "Tell the chief to shake her up more." The mate, glad of an occupation in these tense minutes, flew down to the engine room door. "Skipper says shake her up more," he bawled. The head of the chief engineer appeared, a grisly head now wet with oil and sweat. "What?" he shouted angrily. It was as if he had been propelling the ship with his own arms. Now he was told that his best was not good enough. "What? Shake her up more? Why, she can't carry another pound, I tell you, not another ounce. We—" Suddenly he ran forward and climbed to the bridge. "Captain," he cried in the loud, harsh voice of one who lived usually amid the thunder of machinery, "she can't do it, sir. By God, she can't. She's turning over now faster than she ever did in her life, and we'll all blow to hell." The low-toned, impassive voice of the captain suddenly checked the chief's clamour. "I'll blow her up," he said, "but I won't get catched if I can help it." Even then the listening correspondents found a second in which to marvel that the captain had actually explained his point of view to another human being. The engineer stood blank. Then suddenly he cried, "All right, sir." He threw a hurried look of despair at the correspondents, the deck of the Adolphus, the pursuing enemy, Cuba, the sky, and the sea. He vanished in the direction of his post. A correspondent was suddenly regifted with the power of prolonged speech. "Well, you see, the game is up, damn it. See? We can't get out of it. The skipper will blow up the whole bunch before he'll let his ship be taken, and the Spaniards are gaining. Well, that's what comes from going to war in an 8-knot tub." He bitterly accused himself, the others, and the dark, sightless, indifferent world. This certainty of coming evil affected each one differently. One was made garrulous. One kept absent-mindedly snapping his fingers and gazing at the sea. Another stepped nervously to and fro, looking everywhere as if for employment for his mind. As for Shackles, he was silent and smiling, but it was a new smile that caused the lines about his mouth to betray quivering weakness. and each man looked at the others to discover their degree of fear, and did his best to conceal his own, holding his crackling nerves with all his strength. As the Adolphus rushed on, the sun suddenly emerged from behind grey clouds, and its rays dealt titanic blows so that in a few minutes the sea was a glowing blue plain with the golden shine dancing at the tips of the waves. The coast of Cuba glowed with light. The pursuers displayed detail after detail in the new atmosphere. The voice of the cook was heard in high vexation. "Am I to get dinner as usual? How do I know? Nobody tells me what to do. Am I to get dinner as usual?" The mate answered ferociously. "Of course you are. What do you suppose? Ain't you the cook, you damn fool?" The cook retorted in a mutinous scream. "Well, how would I know? If this ship is a going to blow up " II The captain called from the pilot house, "Mr. Shackles! Oh, Mr. Shackles!" The correspondent moved hastily to a window. "What is it, Captain?" The skipper of the Adolphus raised a battered finger and pointed over the bows. "See 'ere?" he asked, laconic but quietly jubilant. Another steamer was smoking at full speed over the sunlit seas. A great billow of pure white was on her bows. "Great Scott!" cried Shackles. "Another Spaniard?" "No," said the captain. "That there is a United States cruiser." "What?" Shackles was dumbfounded into muscular paralysis. "No. Are you sure?" The captain nodded. "Sure. Take the glass. See her ensign? 2 funnels, 2 masts with fighting tops. She ought to be the Chancellorville." Shackles choked. "Well, I'm blowed." "Ed," said the captain. "Yes, sir." "Tell the chief there is no hurry." Shackles suddenly bethought him of his companions. He dashed to them and was full of quick scorn of their gloomy faces. "Hey, brace up there! Are you blind? Can't you see her?" "See what?" "Why, the Chancellorville, you blind mice!" roared Shackles. "See her? See her? See her?" The others sprang, saw, and collapsed. Shackles was a madman for the purpose of distributing the news. "Cook!" he shrieked. "Don't you see her, cook? Good God, man, don't you see her?" He ran to the lower deck and howled his information everywhere. Suddenly the whole ship smiled. Men clapped each other on the shoulder and joyously shouted. The captain thrust his head from the pilot house to look back at the Spanish ships. Then he looked at the American cruiser. "Now we'll see," he said grimly and vindictively to the mate. "Guess somebody else will do some running." The mate chuckled. The 2 gunboats were still headed hard for the Adolphus, and she kept on her way. The American cruiser was coming swiftly. "It's the Chancellorville!" cried Shackles. "I know her. We'll see a fight at sea, my boys, a fight at sea." The enthusiastic correspondents pranced in Indian revels. The Chancellorville, 2,000 tons, 18.6 knots, 10 5-inch guns, came on tempestuously, sheering the water high with her sharp bow. From her funnels the smoke raced away in driven sheets. She loomed with extraordinary rapidity like a ship bulging and growing out of the sea. She swept by the Adolphus so close that one could have thrown a walnut on board. She was a glistening, grey apparition with a blood-red water line, with brown gun muzzles, and white-clothed, motionless jack tars, and in her rush she was silent, deadly silent. Probably there entered the mind of every man on board the Adolphus a feeling of almost idolatry for this living thing, stern, but to their thought incomparably beautiful. They would have cheered, but that each man seemed to feel that a cheer would be too puny a tribute. It was at first as if she did not see the Adolphus. She was going to pass without heeding this little vagabond of the high seas. But suddenly a megaphone gaped over the rail of her bridge, and a voice was heard measuredly, calmly intoning, "Hello there! Keep well to the nor'ard and out of my way, and I'll go in and see what those people want." Then nothing was heard but the swirl of water. In a moment the Adolphus was looking at a high grey stern. On the quarter deck sailors were poised about the breech of the after pivot gun. The correspondents were revelling. "Captain," yelled Shackles, "we can't miss this. We must see it." But the skipper had already flung over the wheel. "Sure," he answered almost at once. "We can't miss it." The cook was arrogantly, grossly triumphant. His voice rang along the deck. "There now, how will the Spinachers like that? Now it's our turn. We've been doing the running away, but now we'll do the chasing." Apparently feeling some twinge of nerves from the former strain, he suddenly demanded, "Say, who's got any whiskey? I'm near dead for a drink." When the Adolphus came about, she laid her course for a position to the northward of a coming battle, but the situation suddenly became complicated. When the Spanish ships discovered the identity of the ship that was steaming toward them, they did not hesitate over their plan of action. With one accord they turned and ran for port. Laughter arose from the Adolphus. The captain broke his orders, and instead of keeping to the northward, he headed in the wake of the impetuous Chancellorville. The correspondents crowded on the bow. The Spaniards, when their broadsides became visible, were seen to be ships of no importance, mere little gunboats for work in the shallows back of the reefs, and it was certainly discreet to refuse encounter with the 5-inch guns of the Chancellorville. But the joyful Adolphus took no account of this discretion. The pursuit of the Spaniards had been so ferocious that the quick change to heels overhead flight filled that corner of the mind which is devoted to the spirit of revenge. It was this that moved Shackles to yell taunts futilely at the faraway ships. "Well, how do you like it, eh? How do you like it?" The Adolphus was drinking compensation for her previous agony. The mountains of the shore now shadowed high into the sky, and the square white houses of a town could be seen near a vague cleft which seemed to mark the entrance to a port. The gunboats were now near to it. Suddenly white smoke streamed from the bow of the Chancellorville and developed swiftly into a great bulb which drifted in fragments down the wind. Presently the deep-throated boom of the gun came to the ears on board the Adolphus. The shot kicked up a high jet of water into the air astern of the last gunboat. The black smoke from the funnels of the cruiser made her look like a collier on fire, and in her desperation she tried many more long shots, but presently the Adolphus, murmuring disappointment, saw the Chancellorville sheer from the chase. In time they came up with her, and she was an indignant ship. Gloom and wrath was on the forecastle, and wrath and gloom was on the quarter deck. A sad voice from the bridge said, "Just missed 'em." Shackles gained permission to board the cruiser, and in the cabin he talked to Lieutenant Commander Surrey, tall, bald-headed, and angry. "Shoals," said the captain of the Chancellorville. "I can't go any nearer, and those gunboats could steam along a stone sidewalk if only it was wet." Then his bright eyes became brighter. "I'll tell you what. The Chicken, the Holy Moses, and the Mongolian are on station off Nuevitas. If you will do me a favour, why, to morrow I will give those people a game." 3. The Chancellorville lay all night watching off the port of the two gunboats, and soon after daylight the lookout descried 3 smokes to the westward, and they were later made out to be the Chicken, the Holy Moses, and the Adolphus, the latter tagging hurriedly after the United States vessels. The Chicken had been a harbour tug, but she was now the U.S.S. Chicken, by your leave. She carried a 6-pounder forward and a 6-pounder aft, and her main point was her conspicuous vulnerability. The Holy Moses had been the private yacht of a Philadelphia millionaire. She carried 6 6-pounders, and her main point was the chaste beauty of the officers' quarters. On the bridge of the Chancellorville, Lieutenant Commander Surrey surveyed his squadron with considerable satisfaction. Presently he signalled to the lieutenant, who commanded the Holy Moses, and to the boatswain, who commanded the Chicken, to come aboard the flag ship. This was all very well for the captain of the yacht, but it was not so easy for the captain of the tugboat, who had two heavy lifeboats swung 15 feet above the water. He had been accustomed to talking with senior officers from his own pilot house through the intercession of the blessed megaphone. However, he got a lifeboat overside and was pulled to the Chancellorville by 3 men, which cut his crew almost into halves. In the cabin of the Chancellorville, Surrey disclosed to his 2 captains his desires concerning the Spanish gunboats, and they were glad for being ordered down from the Nuevitas station, where life was very dull. He also announced that there was a shore battery containing, he believed, 4 field guns, 3.2's. His draft he spoke of it as his draft would enable him to go in close enough to engage the battery at moderate range, but he pointed out that the main parts of the attempt to destroy the Spanish gunboats must be left to the Holy Moses and the Chicken. His business, he thought, could only be to keep the air so singing about the ears of the battery that the men at the guns would be unable to take an interest in the dash of the smaller American craft into the bay. The officers spoke in their turns. The captain of the Chicken announced that he saw no difficulties. The squadron would follow the senior officer in line ahead, the S.O. would engage the batteries as soon as possible, she would turn to starboard when the depth of water forced her to do so, and the Holy Moses and the Chicken would run past her into the bay and fight the Spanish ships wherever they were to be found. The captain of the Holy Moses, after some moments of dignified thought, said that he had no suggestions to make that would better this plan. Surrey pressed an electric bell. A marine orderly appeared. He was sent with a message. The message brought the navigating officer of the Chancellorville to the cabin, and the 4 men nosed over a chart. In the end, Surrey declared that he had made up his mind, and the juniors remained in expectant silence for 3 minutes while he stared at the bulkhead. Then he said that the plan of the Chicken's captain seemed to him correct in the main. He would make one change. It was that he should first steam in and engage the battery, and the other vessels should remain in their present positions until he signalled them to run into the bay. If the squadron steamed ahead in line, the battery could, if it chose, divide its fire between the cruiser and the gunboats, constituting the more important attack. He had no doubt, he said, that he could soon silence the battery by tumbling the earthworks on to the guns and driving away the men, even if he did not succeed in hitting the pieces. Of course, he had no doubt of being able to silence the battery in 20 minutes. Then he would signal for the Holy Moses and the Chicken to make their rush, and of course he would support them with his fire as much as conditions enabled him. He arose then, indicating that the conference was at an end. In the few moments more that all 4 men remained in the cabin, the talk changed its character completely. It was now unofficial, and the sharp badinage concealed furtive affections, academy friendships, the feelings of old-time shipmates, hiding everything under a veil of jokes. "Well, good luck to you, old boy. Don't get that valuable packet of yours sunk under you. Think how it would weaken the Navy. Would you mind buying me 3 pairs of pajamas in the town yonder? If your engines get disabled, tote her under your arm. You can do it. Good bye, old man. Don't forget to come out all right." When the captains of the Holy Moses and the Chicken emerged from the cabin, they strode the deck with a new step. They were proud men. The marine on duty above their boats looked at them curiously and with awe. He detected something which meant action, conflict. The boats' crews saw it also. As they pulled their steady stroke, they studied fleetingly the face of the officer in the stern sheets. In both cases they perceived a glad man, and yet a man filled with a profound consideration of the future. 4. A bird-like whistle stirred the decks of the Chancellorville. It was followed by the hoarse bellowing of the boatswain's mate. As the cruiser turned her bow toward the shore, she happened to steam near the Adolphus. The usual calm voice hailed the dispatch boat. "Keep
that gauze undershirt of yours well out of the line of fire." "Aye, aye, sir." The cruiser then moved slowly toward the shore, watched by every eye in the smaller American vessels. She was deliberate and steady, and this was reasonable even to the impatience of the other craft, because the wooded shore was likely to suddenly develop new factors. Slowly she swung to starboard. Smoke belched over her, and the roar of a gun came along the water. The battery was indicated by a long, thin streak of yellow earth. The first shot went high, ploughing the chaparral on the hillside. The Chancellorville wore an air for a moment of being deep in meditation. She flung another shell, which landed squarely on the earthwork, making a great dun cloud. Before the smoke had settled there was a crimson flash from the battery. To the watchers at sea it was smaller than a needle. The shot made a geyser of crystal water 400 yards from the Chancellorville. The cruiser, having made up her mind, suddenly went at the battery, hammer and tongs. She moved to and fro casually, but the thunder of her guns was gruff and angry. Sometimes she was quite hidden in her own smoke, but with exceeding regularity the earth of the battery spurted into the air. The Spanish shells, for the most part, went high and wide of the cruiser, jetting the water far away. Once a Spanish gunner took a festive side-show chance at the waiting group of the three nondescripts. It went like a flash over the Adolphus, singing a wistful, metallic note. Whereupon the Adolphus broke hurriedly for the open sea, and men on the Holy Moses and the Chicken laughed hoarsely and cruelly. The correspondents had been standing excitedly on top of the pilot house, but at the passing of the shell they promptly eliminated themselves by dropping with a thud to the deck below. The cook again was giving tongue. "Oh, say, this won't do. I'm damned if it will. We ain't no armoured cruiser, you know. If one of them shells hits us, well, we finish right there. 'Tain't like as if it was our business, foolin' around within the range of them guns. There's no sense in it. Them other fellows don't seem to mind it, but it's their business. If it's your business, you go ahead and you do it. But if it ain't you, look at that, would you?" The Chancellorville had sent up a spread of flags, and the Holy Moses and the Chicken were steaming in. Section 5. The Revenge of the Adolphus, Parts 5 through 7. 5. They, on the Chancellorville, sometimes could see into the bay, and they perceived the enemy's gunboats moving out as if to give battle. Surrey feared that this impulse would not endure, or that it was some mere pretence for the edification of the townspeople and the garrison, so he hastily signalled the Holy Moses and the Chicken to go in. Thankful for small favours, they came on like charging bantams. The battery had ceased firing. As the two auxiliaries passed under the stern of the cruiser, the megaphone hailed them. "You will see the enemy soon as you round the point. A fine chance. Good luck." As a matter of fact, the Spanish gunboats had not been informed of the presence of the Holy Moses and the Chicken off the bar, and they were just blustering down the bay over the protective shoals to make it appear that they scorned the Chancellorville. But suddenly, from around the point, there burst into view a steam yacht, closely followed by a harbour tug. The gunboats took one swift look at this horrible sight and fled screaming. Lieutenant Reigate, commanding the Holy Moses, had under his feet a craft that was capable of some speed, although before a solemn tribunal one would have to admit that she conscientiously belied almost everything that the contractors had said of her originally. Boatswain Pent, commanding the Chicken, was in possession of an utterly different kind. The Holy Moses was an antelope. The Chicken was a man who could carry a piano on his back. In this race, Pent had the mortification of seeing his vessel outstripped badly.
The entrance of the two American craft had had a curious effect upon the shores of the bay. Apparently every one had slept in the assurance that the Chancellorville could not cross the bar, and that the Chancellorville was the only hostile ship. Consequently, the appearance of the Holy Moses and the Chicken created a curious and complete emotion. Reigate, on the bridge of the Holy Moses, laughed when he heard the bugles shrilling and saw through his glasses the wee figures of men running hither and thither on the shore. It was the panic of the China when the bull entered the shop. The whole bay was bright with sun. Every detail of the shore was plain. From a brown hut abeam of the Holy Moses, some little men ran out waving their arms and turning their tiny faces to look at the enemy. Directly ahead, some 4 miles, appeared the scattered white houses of a town with a wharf, and some schooners in front of it. The gunboats were making for the town. There was a stone fort on the hill, overshadowing, but Reigate conjectured that there was no artillery in it. There was a sense of something intimate and impudent in the minds of the Americans. It was like climbing over a wall and fighting a man in his own garden. It was not that they could be in any wise shaken in their resolve. It was simply that the overwhelmingly Spanish aspect of things made them feel like gruff intruders. Like many of the emotions of war time, this emotion had nothing at all to do with war. Reigate's only commissioned subordinate called up from the bow gun, "May I open fire, sir? I think I can fetch that last one." "Yes." Immediately the 6-pounder crashed, and in the air was the spinning wire noise of the flying shot. It struck so close to the last gunboat that it appeared that the spray went aboard. The swift-handed men at the gun spoke of it. "Gave 'em a bath that time, anyhow. First one they've ever had. Dry 'em off this time, Jim." The young ensign said, "Steady." And so the Holy Moses raced in, firing, until the whole town, fort, waterfront, and shipping, were as plain as if they had been done on paper by a mechanical draughtsman. The gunboats were trying to hide in the bosom of the town. One was frantically tying up to the wharf, and the other was anchoring within 100 yards of the shore. The Spanish infantry, of course, had dug trenches along the beach, and suddenly the air over the Holy Moses sung with bullets. The shore line thrummed with musketry. Also some antique shells screamed. 6. The Chicken was doing her best. Pent's posture at the wheel seemed to indicate that her best was about 34 knots. In his eagerness he was braced as if he alone was taking in a 10,000-ton battleship through Hell Gate. But the Chicken was not too far in the rear, and Pent could see clearly that he was to have no minor part to play. Some of the antique shells had struck the Holy Moses, and he could see the escaped steam shooting up from her. She lay close inshore and was lashing out with 4 6-pounders, as if this was the last opportunity she would have to fire them. She had made the Spanish gunboats very sick. A solitary gun on the one moored to the wharf was from time to time firing wildly. Otherwise the gunboats were silent. But the beach in front of the town was a line of fire. The Chicken headed for the Holy Moses, and as soon as possible the 6-pounder in her bow began to crack at the gunboat moored to the wharf. In the meantime the Chancellorville prowled off the bar, listening to the firing, anxious, acutely anxious, and feeling her impotency in every inch of her small steel frame. And in the meantime the Adolphus squatted on the waves and brazenly waited for news. One could thoughtfully count the seconds and reckon that in this second and that second a man had died, if one chose. But no one did it. Undoubtedly the spirit was that the flag should come away with honour, honour complete, perfect, leaving no loose unfinished end over which the Spaniards could erect a monument of satisfaction, glorification. The distant guns boomed to the ears of the silent blue jackets at their stations on the cruiser.
The Chicken steamed up to the Holy Moses and took into her nostrils the odour of steam, gunpowder, and burnt things. Rifle bullets simply steamed over them both. In the merest flash of time, Pent took into his remembrance the body of a dead quartermaster on the bridge of his consort. The two megaphones uplifted together, but Pent's eager voice cried out first: "Are you injured, sir?" "No, not completely. My engines can get me out after we have sunk those gunboats." The voice had been utterly conventional, but it changed to sharpness. "Go in and sink that gunboat at anchor." As the Chicken rounded the Holy Moses and started inshore, a man called to him from the depths of finished disgust. "They're taking to their boats, sir." Pent looked and saw the men of the anchored gunboat lower their boats and pull like mad for shore. The Chicken, assisted by the Holy Moses, began a methodical killing of the anchored gunboat. The Spanish infantry on shore fired frenziedly at the Chicken. Pent, giving the wheel to a waiting sailor, stepped out to a point where he could see the men at the guns. One bullet spanged past him and into the pilot house. He ducked his head into the window. "That hit you, Murray?" he inquired with interest. "No, sir," cheerfully responded the man at the wheel. Pent became very busy superintending the fire of his absurd battery. The anchored gunboat simply would not sink. It evinced that unnatural stubbornness which is sometimes displayed by inanimate objects. The gunboat at the wharf had sunk as if she had been scuttled, but this riddled thing at anchor would not even take fire. Pent began to grow flurried privately. He could not stay there for ever. Why didn't the damned gunboat admit its destruction? Why He was at the forward gun when one of his engine room force came to him and, after saluting, said serenely: "The men at the after gun are all down, sir." It was one of those curious lifts which an enlisted man, without in any way knowing it, can give his officer. The impudent tranquillity of the man at once set Pent to rights, and the stoker departed, admiring the extraordinary coolness of his captain. The next few moments contained little but heat, an odour, applied mechanics, and an expectation of death. Pent developed a fervid and amazed appreciation of the men, his men, men he knew very well, but strange men. What explained them? He was doing his best because he was captain of the Chicken, and he lived or died by the Chicken. But what could move these men to watch his eye in bright anticipation of his orders, and then obey them with enthusiastic rapidity? What caused them to speak of the action as some kind of a joke, particularly when they knew he could overhear them? What manner of men? And he anointed them secretly with his fullest affection. Perhaps Pent did not think all this during the battle. Perhaps he thought it so soon after the battle that his full mind became confused as to the time. At any rate, it stands as an expression of his feeling. The enemy had gotten a field gun round to the shore, and with it they began to throw 3-inch shells at the Chicken. In this war it was usual that the downtrodden Spaniards, in their ignorance, should use smokeless powder, while the Americans, by the power of the consistent everlasting 3-ply wire-woven double back-action imbecility of a hayseed government, used powder which on sea and on land cried their position to heaven, and accordingly good men got killed without reason. At first Pent could not locate the field gun at all, but as soon as he found it, he ran aft with one man and brought the after 6-pounder again into action. He paid little heed to the old gun crew. One was lying on his face, apparently dead. Another was prone with a wound in the chest, while the third sat with his back to the deck house holding a smitten arm. This last one called out huskily: "Give 'em hell, sir!" The minutes of the battle were either days, years, or they were flashes of a second.
Once Pent, looking up, was astonished to see 3 shell holes in the chicken's funnel, made surreptitiously, so to speak. "If we don't silence that field gun, she'll sink us, boys." The eyes of the man sitting with his back against the deck house were looking from out his ghastly face at the new gun crew. He spoke with the supreme laziness of a wounded man. "Give 'em hell." Pent felt a sudden twist of his shoulder. He was wounded slightly. The anchored gunboat was in flames. 7. Pent took his little blood-stained towboat out to the Holy Moses. The yacht was already under way for the bay entrance. As they were passing out of range, the Spaniards heroically redoubled their fire, which is their custom. Pent, moving busily about the decks, stopped suddenly at the door of the engine room. His face was set and his eyes were steely. He spoke to one of the engineers. "During the action I saw you firing at the enemy with a rifle. I told you once to stop, and then I saw you at it again. Pegging away with a rifle is no part of your business. I want you to understand that you are in trouble." The humbled man did not raise his eyes from the deck. Presently the Holy Moses displayed an anxiety for the chicken's health. "1 killed and 4 wounded, sir." "Have you enough men left to work your ship?" After deliberation, Pent answered, "No, sir." "Shall I send you assistance?" "No, sir. I can get to sea all right." As they neared the point they were edified by the sudden appearance of a serio comic ally. The Chancellorville at last had been unable to stand the strain, and had sent in her launch with an ensign, 5 seamen, and a number of marksmen marines. She swept hotfoot around the point, bent on terrible slaughter. The 1-pounder of her bow presented a formidable appearance. The Holy Moses and the chicken laughed until they brought indignation to the brow of the young ensign. But he forgot it when, with some of his men, he boarded the chicken to do what was possible for the wounded. The nearest surgeon was aboard the Chancellorville. There was absolute silence on board the cruiser as the Holy Moses steamed up to report. The blue jackets listened with all their ears. The commander of the yacht spoke slowly into his megaphone. "We have destroyed the 2 gunboats, sir." There was a burst of confused cheering on the forecastle of the Chancellorville, but an officer's cry quelled it. "Very good. Will you come aboard?" 2 correspondents were already on the deck of the cruiser. Before the last of the wounded were hoisted aboard the cruiser, the Adolphus was on her way to Key West. When she arrived at that port of desolation, Shackles fled to file the telegrams, and the other correspondents fled to the hotel for clothes, good clothes, clean clothes, and food, good food, much food, and drink, much drink, any kind of drink. Days afterward, when the officers of the noble squadron received the newspapers containing an account of their performance, they looked at each other somewhat dejectedly. "Heroic assault! Grand daring of Boatswain Pent! Superb accuracy of the Holy Moses fire! Gallant tars of the chicken! Their names should be remembered as long as America stands! Terrible losses of the enemy!" When the Secretary of the Navy ultimately read the report of Commander Surrey, S.O.P., he had to prick himself with a dagger in order to remember that anything at all out of the ordinary had occurred. Section 8. Story 6. The Sergeant's Private Madhouse. The moonlight was almost steady blue flame, and all this radiance was lavished out upon a still, lifeless wilderness of stunted trees and cactus plants. The shadows lay upon the ground, pools of black and sharply outlined, resembling substances, fabrics, and not shadows at all. From afar came the sound of the sea coughing among the hollows in the coral rock. The land was very empty. One could easily imagine that Cuba was a simple, vast solitude. One could wonder at the moon taking all the trouble of this splendid illumination. There was no wind. Nothing seemed to live. But in a particular large group of shadows lay an outpost of some 40 United States Marines. If it had been possible to approach them from any direction without encountering one of their sentries, one could have gone stumbling among sleeping men and men who sat waiting, their blankets tented over their heads. One would have been in among them before one's mind could have decided whether they were men or devils. If a Marine moved, he took the care and the time of one who walks across a death chamber. The lieutenant in command reached for his watch, and the nickel chain gave forth the faintest tinkling sound. He could see the glistening 5 or 6 pairs of eyes that slowly turned to regard him. His sergeant lay near him, and he bent his face down to whisper, "Who's on the post behind the big cactus plant?" "Dryden," replied the sergeant, just over his breath. After a pause the lieutenant murmured, "He's got too many nerves. I shouldn't have put him there." The sergeant asked if he should crawl down and look into affairs at Dryden's post. The young officer nodded assent, and the sergeant, softly cocking his rifle, went away on his hands and knees. The lieutenant, with his back to a dwarf tree, sat watching the sergeant's progress for the few minutes that he could see him moving from one shadow to another. Afterward the officer waited to hear Dryden's quick but low voiced challenge. But time passed and no sound came from the direction of the post behind the cactus bush. The sergeant, as he came nearer and nearer to this cactus bush, a number of peculiarly dignified columns throwing shadows of inky darkness, had slowed his pace, for he did not wish to trifle with the feelings of the sentry, and he was expecting the stern hail, and was ready with the immediate answer which turns away wrath. He was not made anxious by the fact that he could not yet see Dryden, for he knew that the man would be hidden in a way practised by sentry marines since the time when 2 men had been killed by a disease of excessive confidence on picket. Indeed, as the sergeant went still nearer, he became more and more angry. Dryden was evidently a most proper sentry. Finally he arrived at a point where he could see Dryden seated in the shadow, staring into the bushes ahead of him, his rifle ready on his knee. The sergeant in his rage longed for the peaceful precincts of the Washington Marine Barracks, where there would have been no situation to prevent the most complete non-commissioned oratory. He felt indecent in his capacity of a man able to creep up to the back of a G Company member on guard duty. Never mind. In the morning back at camp. But suddenly he felt afraid. There was something wrong with Dryden. He remembered old tales of comrades creeping out to find a picket seated against a tree, perhaps upright enough but stone dead. The sergeant paused and gave the inscrutable back of the sentry a long stare. Dubious, he again moved forward. At 3 paces he hissed like a little snake. Dryden did not show a sign of hearing. At last the sergeant was in a position from which he was able to reach out and touch Dryden on the arm. Whereupon was turned to him the face of a man livid with mad fright. The sergeant grabbed him by the wrist and with discreet fury shook him. "Here, pull yourself together." Dryden paid no heed, but turned his wild face from the newcomer to the ground in front. "Don't you see him, sergeant? Don't you see him?" "Where?" whispered the sergeant. "Ahead and a little on the right flank. A regular skirmish line. Didn't you see him?" "Naw," whispered the sergeant. Dryden began to shake. He began moving one hand from his head to his knee, and from his knee to his head rapidly, in a way that is without explanation. "I don't dare fire," he wept. "If I do they'll see me, and oh, how they'll pepper me!" The sergeant, lying on his belly, understood one thing. Dryden had gone mad. Dryden was the March hare.
The old man gulped down his uproarious emotions as well as he was able, and used the most simple device. "Go," he said, "and tell the lieutenant while I cover your post for you." "No, they'll see me, they'll see me, and then they'll pepper me. Oh, how they'll pepper me!" The sergeant was face to face with the biggest situation of his life. In the first place he knew that at night a large or small force of Spanish guerillas was never more than easy rifle range from any marine outpost, both sides maintaining a secrecy as absolute as possible in regard to their real position and strength. Everything was on a watch spring foundation. A loud word might be paid for by a night attack which would involve 500 men who needed their earned sleep, not to speak of some of them who would need their lives. The slip of a foot and the rolling of a pint of gravel might go from consequence to consequence until various crews went to general quarters on their ships in the harbour, their batteries booming as the swift searchlight flashes tore through the foliage. Men would get killed, notably the sergeant and Dryden, and outposts would be cut off, and the whole night would be one pitiless turmoil. And so Sergeant George H. Peasley began to run his private madhouse behind the cactus bush. "Dryden," said the sergeant, "you do as I tell you and go tell the lieutenant." "I don't dare move," shivered the man. "They'll see me if I move. They'll see me. They're almost up now. Let's hide." "Well, then, you stay here a moment and I'll go and—" Dryden turned upon him a look so tigerish that the old man felt his hair move. "Don't you stir," he hissed. "You want to give me away? You want them to see me? Don't you stir." The sergeant decided not to stir. He became aware of the slow wheeling of eternity, its majestic incomprehensibility of movement. Seconds, minutes, were quaint little things tangible as toys, and there were billions of them, all alike. "Dryden," he whispered at the end of a century in which, curiously, he had never joined the Marine Corps at all, but had taken up another walk of life and prospered greatly in it. "Dryden, this is foolishness." He thought of the expedient of smashing the man over the head with his rifle, but Dryden was so supernaturally alert that there surely would issue some small scuffle, and there could be not even the fraction of a scuffle. The sergeant relapsed into the contemplation of another century. His patient had one fine virtue. He was in such terror of the phantom skirmish line that his voice never went above a whisper, whereas his delusion might have expressed itself in hyena yells and shots from his rifle. The sergeant, shuddering, had visions of how it might have been, the mad private leaping into the air and howling and shooting at his friends and making them the centre of the enemy's eager attention. This, to his mind, would have been conventional conduct for a maniac. The trembling victim of an idea was somewhat puzzling. The sergeant decided from time to time he would reason with his patient. "Look here, Dryden, you don't see any real Spaniards. You've been drinking or something. Now—" But Dryden only glared him into silence. Dryden was inspired with such a profound contempt of him that it was become hatred. "Don't you stir." And it was clear that if the sergeant did stir, the mad private would introduce calamity. "Now," said Peasley to himself, "if those guerillas should take a crack at us to night, they'd find a lunatic asylum right in the front, and it would be astonishing." The silence of the night was broken by the quick, low voice of a sentry to the left some distance. The breathless stillness brought an effect to the words as if they had been spoken in one's ear. "Halt! Who's there? Halt, or I'll fire!" Bang! At the moment of sudden attack, particularly at night, it is improbable that a man registers much detail of either thought or action. He may afterwards say, "I was here." He may say, "I was there. I did this. I did that." But there remains a great incoherency because of the tumultuous thought which seethes through the head. Is this defeat? At night, in a wilderness, and against skilful foes half seen, one does not trouble to ask if it is also death. Defeat is death, then, save for the miraculous, but the exaggerating, magnifying first thought subsides in the ordered mind of the soldier, and he knows soon what he is doing and how much of it. The sergeant's immediate impulse had been to squeeze close to the ground and listen, listen. Above all else, listen. But the next moment he grabbed his private asylum by the scruff of its neck, jerked it to its feet, and started to retreat upon the main outpost. To the left, rifle flashes were bursting from the shadows. To the rear, the lieutenant was giving some hoarse orders or admonition. Through the air swept some Spanish bullets, very high, as if they had been fired at a man in a tree. The private asylum came on so hastily that the sergeant found he could remove his grip, and soon they were in the midst of the men of the outpost. Here there was no occasion for enlightening the lieutenant. In the first place, such surprises required statement, question, and answer. It is impossible to get a grossly original and fantastic idea through a man's head in less than 1 minute of rapid talk, and the sergeant knew the lieutenant could not spare the minute. He himself had no minutes to devote to anything but the business of the outpost, and the madman disappeared from his pen, and he forgot about him. It was a long night, and the little fight was as long as the night. It was a heartbreaking work. The 40 Marines lay in an irregular oval. From all sides the Mauser bullets sang low and hard. Their occupation was to prevent a rush, and to this end they potted carefully at the flash of a Mauser, save when they got excited for a moment, in which case their magazines rattled like a great Waterbury watch. Then they settled again to a systematic potting. The enemy were not of the regular Spanish forces. They were of a corps of guerillas, native-born Cubans, who preferred the flag of Spain. They were all men who knew the craft of the woods, and were all recruited from the district. They fought more like Red Indians than any people but the Red Indians themselves. Each seemed to possess an individuality, a fighting individuality, which is only found in the highest order of irregular soldiers. Personally they were as distinct as possible, but through equality of knowledge and experience they arrived at concert of action. So long as they operated in the wilderness they were formidable troops. It mattered little whether it was daylight or dark. They were mainly invisible. They had schooled from the Cubans insurgent to Spain. As the Cubans fought the Spanish troops, so would these particular Spanish troops fight the Americans. It was wisdom. The Marines thoroughly understood the game. They must lie close and fight until daylight, when the guerillas promptly would go away. They had withstood other nights of this kind, and now their principal emotion was probably a sort of frantic annoyance. Back at the main camp, whenever the roaring volleys lulled, the men in the trenches could hear their comrades of the outpost and the guerillas pattering away interminably. The moonlight faded and left an equal darkness upon the wilderness. A man could barely see the comrade at his side. Sometimes guerillas crept so close that the flame from their rifles seemed to scorch the faces of the Marines, and the reports sounded as if from 2 or 3 inches of their very noses. If a pause came, one could hear the guerillas gabbling to each other in a kind of drunken delirium. The lieutenant was praying that the ammunition would last. Everybody was praying for daybreak. A black hour came finally, when the men were not fit to have their troubles increased. The enemy made a wild attack on one portion of the oval, which was held by about 15 men. The remainder of the force was busy enough, and the 15 were naturally left to their devices. Amid the whirl of it a loud voice suddenly broke out in song. When shepherds guard their flocks by night, all seated on the ground, an angel of the Lord came down, and glory shone around. "Who the hell is that?" demanded the lieutenant from a throat full of smoke. There was almost a full stop of the firing. The Americans were somewhat puzzled. Practical ones muttered that the fool should have a bayonet hilt shoved down his throat. Others felt a thrill at the strangeness of the thing. Perhaps it was a sign. "The minstrel boy to war was gone, in the ranks of death you'll find him, his father's sword he has girded on, and his wild harp slung behind him." This croak was as lugubrious as a coffin. "Who is it? Who is it?" snapped the lieutenant. "Stop him, somebody!" "It's Dryden, sir," said old Sergeant Peasley, as he felt around in the darkness for his madhouse. "I can't find him yet." "Please, oh, do not let me fall. You're ugh!" The sergeant had pounced upon him. This singing had had an effect upon the Spaniards. At first they had fired frenziedly at the voice, but they soon ceased, perhaps from sheer amazement. Both sides took a spell of meditation. The sergeant was having some difficulty with his charge. "Here, you! Grab him! Take him by the throat! Be quiet, you devil!" One of the 15 men who had been hard pressed called out: "We've only got about 1 clip apiece, Lieutenant. If they come again—" The lieutenant crawled to and fro among his men, taking clips of cartridges from those who had many. He came upon the sergeant and his madhouse. He felt Dryden's belt and found it simply stuffed with ammunition. He examined Dryden's rifle and found in it a full clip. The madhouse had not fired a shot. The lieutenant distributed these valuable prizes among the 15 men. As the men gratefully took them, one said: "If they had come again hard enough they would have had us, sir. Maybe." But the Spaniards did not come again. At the first indication of daybreak they fired their customary good bye volley. The marines lay tight while the slow dawn crept over the land. Finally the lieutenant arose among them, and he was a bewildered man, but very angry. "Now where is that idiot, sergeant?" "Here he is, sir," said the old man cheerfully. He was seated on the ground beside the recumbent Dryden, who, with an innocent smile on his face, was sound asleep. "Wake him up," said the lieutenant briefly. The sergeant shook the sleeper. "Here, minstrel boy, turn out. The lieutenant wants you." Dryden climbed to his feet and saluted the officer with a dazed and childish air. "Yes, sir." The lieutenant was obviously having difficulty in governing his feelings, but he managed to say with calmness: "You seemed to be fond of singing, Dryden. Sergeant, see if he has any whisky on him." "Sir?" said the madhouse, stupefied. "Singing? Fond of singing?" Here the sergeant interposed gently, and he and the lieutenant held palaver apart from the others. The marines, hitching more comfortably their almost empty belts, spoke with grins of the madhouse. "Well, the minstrel boy made 'em clear out. They couldn't stand it. But I wouldn't want to be in his boots. He'll see fireworks when the old man interviews him on the uses of grand opera in modern warfare. How do you think he managed to smuggle a bottle along without us finding it out?" When the weary outpost was relieved and marched back to camp, the men could not rest until they had told a tale of the voice in the wilderness. In the meantime the sergeant took Dryden aboard a ship, and to those who took charge of the man he defined him as "the most useful crazy man in the service of the United States." Section 10. Story 7. Virtue in War. Parts 1 through 3. 1. Gates had left the regular army in 1890, those parts of him which had not been frozen having been well fried. He took with him nothing but an oaken constitution and a knowledge of the plains and the best wishes of his fellow officers. The Standard Oil Company differs from the United States government in that it understands the value of the loyal and intelligent services of good men,
and is almost certain to reward them at the expense of incapable men. This curious practice emanates from no beneficent emotion of the Standard Oil Company, on whose feelings you could not make a scar with a hammer and chisel. It is simply that the Standard Oil Company knows more than the United States government, and makes use of virtue whenever virtue is to its advantage. In 1890 Gates really felt in his bones that if he lived a rigorously correct life, and several score of his classmates and intimate friends died off, he would get command of a troop of horse by the time he was unfitted by age to be an active cavalry leader. He left the service of the United States and entered the service of the Standard Oil Company. In the course of time he knew that if he lived a rigorously correct life, his position and income would develop strictly in parallel with the worth of his wisdom and experience, and he would not have to walk on the corpses of his friends. But he was not happier. Part of his heart was in a barracks, and it was not enough to discourse of the old regiment over the port and cigars to ears which were polite enough to betray a languid ignorance. Finally came the year 1898, and Gates dropped the Standard Oil Company as if it were hot. He hit the steel rail to Washington, and there fought the first serious action of the war. Like most Americans, he had a native state, and one morning he found himself major in a volunteer infantry regiment, whose voice had a peculiar sharp twang to it which he could remember from childhood. The colonel welcomed the West Pointer with loud cries of joy. The lieutenant colonel looked at him with a pebbly eye of distrust, and the senior major, having had up to this time the best battalion in the regiment, strongly disapproved of him. There were only two majors, so the lieutenant colonel commanded the first battalion, which gave him an occupation. Lieutenant colonels under the new rules do not always have occupations. Gates got the third battalion, 4 companies commanded by intelligent officers who could gauge the opinions of their men at 2,000 yards and govern themselves accordingly. The battalion was immensely interested in the new major. It thought it ought to develop views about him. It thought it was its blankety-blank business to find out immediately if it liked him personally. In the company streets the talk was nothing else. Among the non-commissioned officers there were 11 old soldiers of the regular army, and they knew, and cared, that Gates had held commission in the 16th Cavalry, as Harper's Weekly says. Over this fact they rejoiced and were glad, and they stood by to jump lively when he took command. He would know his work, and he would know their work, and then in battle there would be killed only what men were absolutely necessary, and the sick list would be comparatively free of fools. The commander of the 2nd Battalion had been called by an Atlanta paper Major Ricketts C. Carmony, the commander of the 2nd Battalion of the 307th is when at home one of the biggest wholesale hardware dealers in his state. Last evening he had ice cream, at his own expense, served out at the regular mess of the battalion, and after dinner the men gathered about his tent, where 3 hearty cheers for the popular major were given. Carmony had bought 12 copies of this newspaper and mailed them home to his friends. In Gates's battalion there were more kicks than ice cream, and there was no ice cream at all. Indignation ran high at the rapid manner in which he proceeded to make soldiers of them. Some of his officers hinted finely that the men wouldn't stand it. They were saying that they had enlisted to fight for their country. Yes, but they weren't going to be bullied day in and day out by a perfect stranger. They were patriots, they were, and just as good men as ever stepped, just as good as Gates or anybody like him. But gradually, despite itself, the battalion progressed. The men were not altogether conscious of it. They evolved rather blindly. Presently there were fights with Carmony's crowd as to which was the better battalion at drills, and at last there was no argument. It was generally admitted that Gates commanded the crack battalion.
The men, believing that the beginning and the end of all soldiering was in these drills of precision, were somewhat reconciled to their major when they began to understand more of what he was trying to do for them, but they were still fiery, untamed patriots of lofty pride, and they resented his manner toward them. It was abrupt and sharp. The time came when everybody knew that the Fifth Army Corps was the corps designated for the first active service in Cuba. The officers and men of the 307th observed with despair that their regiment was not in the Fifth Army Corps. The colonel was a strategist. He understood everything in a flash. Without a moment's hesitation he obtained leave and mounted the night express for Washington. There he drove senators and congressmen in span, tandem, and four in hand. With the telegraph he stirred so deeply the governor, the people, and the newspapers of his state that whenever on a quiet night the president put his head out of the White House he could hear the distant, vast Commonwealth humming with indignation. And as it is well known that the chief executive listens to the voice of the people, the 307th was transferred to the Fifth Army Corps. It was sent at once to Tampa, where it was brigaded with two dusty regiments of regulars, who looked at it calmly and said nothing. The brigade commander happened to be no less a person than Gates's old colonel in the 16th Cavalry, as Harper's Weekly says, and Gates was cheered. The old man's rather solemn look brightened when he saw Gates in the 307th. There was a great deal of battering and pounding and banging for the 307th at Tampa, but the men stood it more in wonder than in anger. The two regular regiments carried them along when they could, and when they couldn't, waited impatiently for them to come up. Undoubtedly the regulars wished the volunteers were in garrison at Sitka, but they said practically nothing. They minded their own regiments. The colonel was an invaluable man in a telegraph office. When came the scramble for transports, the colonel retired to a telegraph office and talked so ably to Washington that the authorities pushed a number of corps aside and made way for the 307th, as if on it depended everything. The regiment got one of the best transports, and after a series of delays and some starts and an equal number of returns, they finally sailed for Cuba. II. Now Gates had a singular adventure on the second morning after his arrival at Atlanta to take his post as major of the 307th. He was in his tent, writing, when suddenly the flap was flung away and a tall young private stepped inside. "Well, Maje," said the newcomer genially, "how goes it?" The major's head flashed up, but he spoke without heat. "Come to attention and salute." "Huh?" said the private. "Come to attention and salute." The private looked at him in resentful amazement, and then inquired, "You ain't mad, are you? Ain't nothing to get huffy about, is there?" "I come to attention and salute." "Well," drawled the private as he stared, "seein' as you're so darned particular, I don't care if I do, and if it'll make your meals set on your stomach any better." Drawing a long breath and grinning ironically, he lazily pulled his heels together and saluted with a flourish. "There," he said, with a return to his earlier genial manner. "How's that suit you, Maje?" There was a silence which to an impartial observer would have seemed pregnant with dynamite and bloody death. Then the major cleared his throat and coldly said, "And now what is your business?" "Who, me?" asked the private. "Oh, I just sorter dropped in." With a deeper meaning he added, "Sorter dropped in a friendly way, thinkin' you was maybe a different kind of feller from what you be." The inference was clearly marked. It was now Gates's turn to stare, and stare he unfeignedly did. "Go back to your quarters," he said at length. The volunteer became very angry. "Oh, you needn't be so up in the air, need you? Don't know's I'm dead anxious to inflict my company on yer, since I've had a good look at you. There may be men in this here battalion what's had just as much education as you have, and I'm damned if they ain't got better manners. Good mornin'," he said, with dignity, and passing out of the tent he flung the flap back in place with an air of slamming it as if it had been a door. He made his way back to his company street, striding high. He was furious. He met a large crowd of his comrades. "What's the matter, Lige?" asked one, who noted his temper. "Oh, nothin'," answered Lige, with terrible feeling. "Nothin'. I just been lookin' over the new major, that's all." "What's he like?" asked another. "Like!" cried Lige. "'E's like nothin'. He ain't out'n the same kittle as us is. No. God made him all by himself, separate. He's a special product, he is, and he won't have no truck with jest common men like you be." He made a venomous gesture, which included them all. "Did he set on ye?" asked a soldier. "Set on me? No," replied Lige, with contempt. "I set on him. I sized him up in a minute. 'Oh, I don't know,' I says as I was comin' out. 'Guess you ain't the only man in the world,' I says." For a time Lige Wigram was quite a hero. He endlessly repeated the tale of his adventure, and men admired him for so soon taking the conceit out of the new officer. Lige was proud to think of himself as a plain and simple patriot who had refused to endure any high-soaring nonsense. But he came to believe that he had not disturbed the singular composure of the major, and this concreted his hatred. He hated Gates, not as a soldier sometimes hates an officer, a hatred half of fear. Lige hated as man to man, and he was enraged to see that so far from gaining any hatred in return, he seemed incapable of making Gates have any thought of him save as a unit in a body of 300 men. Lige might just as well have gone and grimaced at the obelisk in Central Park. When the battalion became the best in the regiment, he had no part in the pride of the companies. He was sorry when men began to speak well of Gates. He was really a very consistent hater. 3. The transport occupied by the 307th was commanded by some sort of a Scandinavian who was afraid of the shadows of his own topmasts. He would have run his steamer away from a floating Gainsborough hat, and in fact he ran her away from less on some occasions. The officers, wishing to arrive with the other transports, sometimes remonstrated, and to them he talked of his owners. Every officer in the convoying warships loathed him, for in case any hostile vessel should appear they did not see how they were going to protect this rabbit, who would probably manage during a fight to be in about 100 places on the broad, broad sea, and all of them offensive to the Navy's plan. When he was not talking of his owners, he was remarking to the officers of the regiment that a steamer really was not like a valise, and that he was unable to take his ship under his arm and climb trees with it. He further said that "them naval fellows were not near so smart as they thought they were." From an indigo sea arose the lonely shore of Cuba. Ultimately the fleet was near Santiago, and most of the transports were bidden to wait a minute while the leaders found out their minds. The skipper, to whom the 307th were prisoners, waited for 30 hours halfway between Jamaica and Cuba. He explained that the Spanish fleet might emerge from Santiago harbor at any time, and he did not propose to be caught. His owners Whereupon the colonel arose as one having 900 men at his back, and he passed up to the bridge and he spake with the captain. He explained indirectly that each individual of his 900 men had decided to be the first American soldier to land for this campaign, and that in order to accomplish the marvel it was necessary for the transport to be nearer than 45 miles from the Cuban coast. If the skipper would only land the regiment, the colonel would consent to his then taking his interesting old ship and going to H with it. And the skipper spake with the colonel. He pointed out that as far as he officially was concerned, the United States government did not exist. He was responsible solely to his owners. The colonel pondered these sayings. He perceived that the skipper meant that he was running his ship as he deemed best, in consideration of the capital invested by his owners, and that he was not at all concerned with the feelings of a certain American military expedition to Cuba. He was a free son of the sea. He was a sovereign citizen of the Republic of the Ways. He was like Lige. However, the skipper ultimately incurred the danger of taking his ship under the terrible guns of the New York, Iowa, Oregon, Massachusetts, Indiana, Brooklyn, Texas, and a score of cruisers and gunboats. It was a brave act for the captain of a United States transport, and he was visibly nervous until he could again get to sea, where he offered praises that the accursed 307th was no longer sitting on his head. For almost a week he rambled at his cheerful will over the adjacent high seas, having in his hold a great quantity of military stores, as successfully secreted as if they had been buried in a copper box in the corner stone of a new public building in Boston. He had had his master's certificate for 21 years, and those people couldn't tell a marlinspike from the starboard side of the ship. The 307th was landed in Cuba, but to their disgust they found that about 10,000 regulars were ahead of them. They got immediate orders to move out from the base on the road to Santiago. Gates was interested to note that the only delay was caused by the fact that many men of the other battalions strayed off sightseeing. In time the long regiment wound slowly among hills that shut them from the sight of the sea. For the men to admire there were palm trees, little brown huts, passive, uninterested Cuban soldiers, much worn from carrying American rations inside and outside. The weather was not oppressively warm, and the journey was said to be only about 7 miles. There were no rumors save that there had been one short fight, and the army had advanced to within sight of Santiago. Having a peculiar faculty for the derision of the romantic, the 307th began to laugh. Actually, there was not anything in the world which turned out to be as books describe it. Here they had landed from the transport, expecting to be at once flung into line of battle and sent on some kind of furious charge, and now they were trudging along a quiet trail lined with somnolent trees and grass. The whole business so far struck them as being a highly tedious burlesque. After a time they came to where the camps of regular regiments marked the sides of the road, little villages of tents no higher than a man's waist. The colonel found his brigade commander, and the 307th was sent off into a field of long grass, where the men grew suddenly solemn with the importance of getting their supper. In the early evening some regulars told one of Gates's company that at daybreak this division would move to an attack upon something. "How'd you know?" said the company, deeply awed. "Heard it." "Well, what are we to attack?" "Dunno." The 307th was not at all afraid, but each man began to imagine the morrow. The regulars seemed to have as much interest in the morrow as they did in the last Christmas. It was none of their affair, apparently. "Look here," said Lige Wigram to a man in the 17th Regular Infantry, "whereabouts are we going to morrow, and who do we run up against, do you know?" The 17th soldier replied truculently, "If I catch the what stole my terbacker, I'll whirl in and break every bone in his body." Gates's friends in the regular regiments asked him numerous questions as to the reliability of his organization. Would the 307th stand the racket? They were certainly not contemptuous. They simply did not seem to consider it important whether the 307th would or whether it would not. "Well," said Gates, "they won't run the length of a tent peg if they can gain any idea of what they're fighting. They won't bunch if they've about 6 acres of open ground to move in. They won't get rattled at all if they see you fellows taking it easy, and they'll fight like the devil as long as they thoroughly, completely, absolutely, satisfactorily, exhaustively understand what the business is. They're lawyers. All except in my battalion." Section 10